The reset you actually need. The alarm goes off at 6:47 a.m. Before your eyes have adjusted to the light, before you've registered what day it is, before you've taken a conscious breath, your hand is already moving. It crosses the bed, finds the phone on the nightstand, and the screen unlocks. You're not even sure what you were looking for, a text, maybe, or news, or nothing in particular. You just needed to check. Within 40 seconds of waking, you are inside someone else's engineered world, scrolling through a stream of content that began in the middle of the night and will keep going long after you put the phone down. And somewhere in the back of your mind, behind the headlines and the notifications, there is a faint, persistent feeling you can't quite name. It isn't excitement. It isn't satisfaction. It is closer to urgency, the vague sensation that something important is happening and you might be missing it. That feeling is not an accident. It is the product of a years-long relationship between your brain and every app, platform, and screen that has ever competed for your attention. And it is quietly costing you more than you realize. This book is not going to tell you to throw away your phone. It is not going to recommend that you spend a week in silent meditation, eat nothing but lentils, and renounce all forms of entertainment. There is a version of this conversation, you've probably encountered it, that slides quickly into asceticism, into a kind of competitive purification where the goal seems to be suffering as a signal of seriousness. That is not what this is. What this book offers instead is something more useful and, ultimately, more sustainable, a recalibration. A reset. What the dopamine detox trend gets right and wrong over the past several years, a concept called the dopamine detox has spread across wellness communities, productivity blogs, and self-improvement YouTube channels with remarkable speed. The idea, in its popular form, is that modern life bombards us with so much stimulation, social media, junk food, pornography, video games, that our dopamine systems become exhausted or corrupted, and the solution is to abstain from all pleasurable activities for a period of time, thereby flushing the dopamine from your system and returning to a clean baseline. The impulse behind this is genuine and correct. Something is wrong. Many people feel it. Life is faster, louder, and more demanding of attention than it has ever been, and there is a widespread, low-grade sense of being overstimulated and simultaneously unfulfilled, endlessly busy and yet chronically bored, unable to focus and yet unable to rest. The people drawn to the dopamine detox trend are responding to a real problem. The science, however, is slightly off. And the slight offness matters, because if you misdiagnose a problem, the cure won't work. Dopamine is not a toxin. You cannot detox it. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger produced by your own brain that is present and active every moment of your waking life, and much of your sleeping life. It plays a role in movement, in memory, in motivation, in how you feel about the future. Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by the progressive loss of dopamine-producing neurons, illustrates what a world without dopamine actually looks like: rigidity, tremor, difficulty initiating movement, depression, and a profound loss of forward motivation. Dopamine is not the enemy. It is not a contaminant to be purged. It is essential. What goes wrong is not the presence of dopamine but the calibration of the system that uses it. After months and years of exposure to highly engineered, high-stimulation activities, the kind that trigger sharp, repeated dopamine responses, the brain adjusts. It adapts. The sensitivity of the reward system shifts to accommodate the new normal, and activities that once felt genuinely satisfying begin to feel flat. Reading a novel feels slow. A walk in the park feels boring. A conversation with a friend feels insufficient. The high-stimulation activities haven't stopped being pleasurable in any absolute sense, but everything else has started to feel comparatively dim, because the baseline against which your brain measures reward has been raised dramatically. This is not detoxification. This is recalibration. And that distinction changes everything about how you approach the problem. What a dopamine reset actually is: think of your brain's reward system as having a volume dial. Under ordinary circumstances, the kind of life humans lived for most of our evolutionary history, the dial sits at a moderate setting. The smell of food cooking activates it. Finishing a difficult task activates it. Physical exertion followed by rest activates it. Laughter with someone you love activates it. These ordinary pleasures feel like pleasures because the system is calibrated to receive them. Now imagine turning the dial up hard for an extended period. Loud music, constant stimulation, instant gratification at every moment. After enough time in that environment, when someone turns the music back to a moderate volume, it doesn't just seem quieter. It seems like silence. It seems like deprivation. But the music hasn't changed. Your perception of it has. A dopamine reset is the process of deliberately reducing the intensity and frequency of high stimulation inputs long enough for your brain's reward sensitivity to return toward its natural baseline. It is not about eliminating pleasure. It is about restoring your capacity to feel ordinary pleasure as pleasure, to find meaning, satisfaction, and genuine enjoyment in activities and experiences that are real and sustainable, rather than engineered. This process works. It is supported by a substantial body of neuroscientific and psychological research, much of which we will explore in the chapters ahead. It does not require perfection. It does not require extraordinary willpower. It requires understanding, structure, and a willingness to tolerate discomfort, not forever, but for long enough to matter. What this book is, and isn't, let's be clear about what you are and aren't signing up for. This book is not a program of self-punishment. You will not be asked to sit in a dark room for 2 weeks doing nothing. You will not be required to give up coffee, entertainment, social connection, or any of the things that make life worth living. The goal is not deprivation. The goal is discernment, learning to distinguish between the things that genuinely nourish your nervous system and the things that merely exploit it. This book is not anti-technology. The tools and platforms that have contributed to overstimulation in modern life are not going away, and demonizing them entirely is both intellectually lazy and practically useless. The more interesting question, and the one this book is focused on, is how you can develop a different kind of relationship with these tools. One where you are the one choosing when and how to engage, rather than being pulled by systems that were designed to make choice feel irrelevant. This book is also not a one-size-fits-all prescription. People arrive at overstimulation from different directions, with different patterns, different vulnerabilities, and different lives. A parent of 3 young children has a different challenge than a 23-year-old living alone. A person who struggles primarily with social media has a different starting point than someone whose main issue is gaming or streaming. The framework in this book is tiered and flexible, designed so that you can diagnose your own situation accurately and choose the approach that fits your actual life. What this book is, a practical, research-informed guide to understanding why your brain works the way it does, recognizing where your particular reward system has been pushed out of calibration, and taking concrete steps to recalibrate it. The process is divided into 3 parts, and they build on each other deliberately. How this book is structured. The first part of the book, the section you are beginning now, is about understanding the science. Not in the abstract, theoretical way of a textbook, but in the grounded, applied way of someone who wants to understand a problem well enough to actually solve it. Chapter 1 digs into what dopamine actually does, which is more complicated and interesting than most people think, and Chapter 2 examines how the modern attention economy has learned to exploit the dopamine system for commercial gain. These are not detours. Understanding this material is what makes everything that follows more than just a list of rules to follow. When you understand why the system works the way it does, you stop needing to rely on willpower alone. You can work with the architecture of your own mind. The second part of the book is about diagnosis. Before you can reset anything, you need to know what you're dealing with. These chapters will help you identify your own patterns of overstimulation, the specific triggers, habits, and contexts that have been pulling your reward system out of balance. This section includes honest self-assessment tools, not as a way of generating shame but as a way of generating clarity. You cannot navigate toward a destination you can't see. The third part of the book is the reset itself, a tiered, practical protocol that you can adapt to your own circumstances. The tiers range from a light recalibration, appropriate if your symptoms are mild and your schedule is demanding, to a more substantial reset, appropriate if you've been deeply overstimulated for a long time and are ready to make significant changes. Each tier comes with specific guidance: what to reduce, what to add, how to handle the discomfort that will almost certainly appear in the first few days, and how to build the habits that make the reset stick over the long term. Every chapter ends with a practical reflection, a short exercise or question designed to help you engage with the material personally, not just intellectually. These are not homework assignments. They are invitations. You can take them or leave them, but the people who take them tend to get significantly more out of this process. Why this matters more than you think. It would be easy to frame this book as a productivity project, a way to focus better at work, get more done, stop wasting time on your phone. And yes, those outcomes tend to follow from a successful reset. But the deeper stakes are different and more important. The reward system is not a peripheral feature of your mind. It is central to who you are and how you experience being alive. When it is calibrated well, you experience something that researchers sometimes call reward sensitivity, the capacity to feel genuine pleasure, motivation, and meaning from ordinary life. You want to do things. You look forward to experiences. The future feels like it holds something worth moving toward. When the system is chronically overstimulated and sensitivity has dropped, something else happens. Motivation becomes effortful and brittle. Sleep is worse, because a dysregulated dopamine system keeps the brain in a state of low-level arousal that resists rest. Relationships become harder, because real human connection is slower and more ambiguous than the frictionless social approval of a like or a comment, and your brain has learned to prefer speed and clarity. The capacity for deep work, for sustained concentration on anything difficult and meaningful, quietly erodes. None of this happens all at once. None of it is dramatic enough to notice on any given day. But over months and years, the accumulated effect is significant. It shows up in the background dissatisfaction that colors everything without ever fully breaking the surface. In the feeling of being somehow unfulfilled despite having, objectively, a great deal to be grateful for. In the restlessness that appears the moment there is nothing to look at or listen to. A reset addresses all of this at the root. It is one of the most high-leverage things you can do for your focus, your motivation, your sleep, your emotional stability, and your relationships, not because it solves every problem, but because a well-calibrated reward system is the foundation on which everything else is built. A word before you begin: the first few days of any reset involve discomfort. This is predictable, and it is actually a good sign. It means the system is recalibrating, and that the things you've been relying on for stimulation have been having more of an effect on your nervous system than you may have realized. The discomfort is not dangerous. It is not permanent. And it is not a signal to stop. What you will likely notice, if you engage with this process honestly, is that the discomfort tends to peak somewhere between day 2 and day 4, and then something shifts. The restlessness begins to quiet. Slower activities become more interesting. You start noticing things again: the quality of light in the afternoon, the pleasure of finishing a meal, the particular texture of a conversation that isn't being performed for an audience. These aren't small things. They are the texture of a life fully inhabited. That experience is available to you. It is what your brain was designed to seek and find rewarding. It has simply been obscured, temporarily, by a very loud and very deliberate noise. Let's turn the volume down. Practical reflection before moving to the next chapter: take 5 minutes for this single exercise. You don't need to write anything down unless that helps you think. Sit somewhere without your phone for 5 minutes. Not meditating, just sitting. Notice what happens in your body and mind. Do you feel an urge to check something? A mild but persistent restlessness? A thought that you should be doing something else, something more useful or more interesting? Whatever arises, just observe it. Don't judge it. Don't try to stop it. That impulse, that pull toward stimulation even when nothing is actually wrong, is the thing this book is about. You've just met it consciously, possibly for the first time. That meeting is the beginning of the reset. The seeking chemical in the 1990s, a neuroscientist named Kent Berridge was running experiments on rats at the University of Michigan and arrived at a conclusion that quietly upended one of the most widely held assumptions in brain science. The assumption was simple, intuitive, and almost certainly something you hold yourself: dopamine equals pleasure. The idea had been so embedded in popular culture and even in scientific thinking for so long that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. Dopamine was the brain's reward chemical. It was what you felt when something good happened. It was the rush of the hit, the warmth of satisfaction, the neurological signature of enjoyment. Berridge's research showed that this was wrong. Not entirely wrong, but wrong enough to matter, wrong in a way that, once you understand it, changes how you see your own behavior, your own cravings, and your own unhappiness in a way that almost nothing else can. What Berridge discovered, through a series of meticulous experiments in which he disrupted the dopamine systems of rats while leaving other neurochemical systems intact, was that the animals still liked pleasurable things, they still showed the same facial expressions of enjoyment when given sweet food, but they stopped wanting them. They would not seek them out. They would not work for them. Presented with something pleasurable, they could still experience the pleasure. But without dopamine, the drive to pursue that pleasure evaporated entirely. The seeking stopped. This distinction between wanting and liking is one of the most important ideas in modern neuroscience, and it is the key to understanding everything that happens when the dopamine system gets pushed out of calibration by modern life. The real function of dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. It is the seeking chemical. It is the neurological engine of anticipation, of motivation, of the forward lean towards something you desire. It is what gets you out of bed in the morning before the coffee is ready, what makes you refresh the email even before the reply has had time to arrive, what produces the particular electricity of waiting for something you want very much. The pleasure itself, the warm, satisfied feeling of actually having the thing, is produced largely by a different set of chemicals, particularly the opioid system and serotonin. Dopamine gets you to the door. The opioids let you in. This distinction sounds academic until you realize what it means in practice. It means that dopamine can drive you relentlessly towards something that, when you get it, doesn't actually feel that good. It means that the craving can be far more powerful than the reward. It means that you can be caught in a loop where you are perpetually seeking, perpetually anticipating, perpetually reaching, and perpetually, subtly disappointed. Sound familiar? Berridge's framework, wanting versus liking, maps almost perfectly onto the experience of compulsive social media use, compulsive eating, compulsive gambling, and many of the other behaviors that people find themselves struggling to control in the modern world. The wanting is enormous. The liking, when it arrives, is often barely there at all. You scroll through Instagram for 40 minutes and put the phone down feeling slightly worse than before. You eat the entire bag of chips and feel not satisfied but uncomfortable, already thinking about what comes next. The slot machine pays out and the winning feels hollow before you've finished counting the coins. The dopamine loop drove you there. The pleasure system received you with a shrug. The architecture of the loop, understanding the dopamine loop in its full form, is essential to understanding both why modern life is so effective at capturing our attention and what it actually takes to recalibrate the system. The loop has 4 stages. It begins with a trigger, some cue in the environment or inside your own mind that activates the dopamine system. The trigger does not need to be the thing itself. It can be a time of day, a location, a feeling, or even just the sight of a device. Addictions researchers call these cues conditioned stimuli. Through repetition, they have become associated with a reward, and the mere presence of the cue is enough to initiate the neurochemical cascade. This is why walking into a kitchen can make you hungry when you aren't, why seeing your phone on the table activates a low-level urge to pick it up even when you weren't thinking about it a moment before. The trigger activates craving, the wanting state. This is dopamine's home territory. The craving is not neutral. It is experienced as a kind of pressure, an urgency, a narrowing of attention. When the wanting system is activated, everything that isn't relevant to the potential reward fades slightly into the background. This is partly why it is so difficult to concentrate on something else when you're in the middle of a craving. The neurological architecture of wanting is designed to focus you. Then comes action, the behavior that pursues the reward. Picking up the phone. Opening the app. Reaching for the snack. Placing the bet. The dopamine system has done its job, it motivated you to move toward the thing. And finally, the reward. This is where the opioid system takes over, and this is also where the experience often fails to deliver what the craving promised. The reward is real, there is a genuine neurochemical response, but it is typically smaller, shorter, and less satisfying than the anticipation suggested it would be. This gap between wanting and liking is not a bug in the system. It is a feature. If the reward fully satisfied the craving every time, the loop would close cleanly and you'd stop. The slight insufficiency of the reward is what keeps the loop running. It is what makes you put the phone down and pick it up again 4 minutes later. This loop of trigger, craving, action, reward is not a pathology. It is the basic architecture of motivated behavior. It is how you learn to seek food when hungry, warmth when cold, connection when lonely. The loop is not the problem. The problem is what happens when it is exploited. The exploitation model modern entertainment, social media, gambling, and ultra-processed food industries did not accidentally stumble upon the dopamine loop. They studied it, refined it, and built billion-dollar business models on top of it. The degree of intentionality involved in the design of these systems is, once you understand it, genuinely striking. Social media platforms discovered early that the most powerful trigger for sustained engagement is social validation, the approval and attention of other people. This is not a trivial observation. Humans are deeply social animals with a powerful neurological sensitivity to how they are perceived by others. The like button is a genius piece of behavioral engineering precisely because it transforms a complex and nuanced social reality into a simple, quantified dopamine trigger. Your post gets 20 likes. The dopamine system responds. You post again. The trigger is slightly unpredictable, sometimes the response is large, sometimes small, sometimes absent, and as we will explore in detail in the next chapter, this unpredictability is not a design flaw. It is the mechanism. Ultra-processed foods are engineered using what food scientists call the bliss point, a precise combination of salt, sugar, fat, and texture that maximizes palatability while minimizing satiation. The food is calibrated to keep you wanting without ever fully satisfying the want. The crunch of a chip, the initial sweetness, the fat content that coats the mouth, each element of these products has been refined through extensive testing to produce an optimal dopamine response. People sometimes feel ashamed of being unable to stop eating certain foods, as if the failure were a personal one. It isn't. It is the predictable outcome of eating something that was specifically designed to defeat the stopping mechanisms of the human brain. Understanding this is not meant to make you feel helpless. It is meant to make you feel less confused about why certain behaviors feel so hard to control, and more clear-eyed about what you're actually dealing with when you try to change them. The baseline problem here is where the story takes a turn that is personally consequential for almost anyone living in the contemporary world. The dopamine system is adaptive. Like many systems in the body, it does not maintain a fixed response to a fixed input, it adjusts based on patterns of stimulation over time. This is one of the brain's most remarkable features. It means you can learn, that experiences can change you, that the brain is not a static machine but a living, changing organ. It also means that when you subject the dopamine system to repeated high-intensity stimulation, it adjusts to that level of stimulation. It recalibrates upward. Researchers call this downregulation. When dopamine receptors are repeatedly flooded with dopamine, as they are during extended periods of high stimulation activity, the receptors become less sensitive. The system requires more stimulation to produce the same response. This is, at a neurochemical level, essentially what happens with any substance or activity that generates tolerance. More is required to produce the same effect, and the baseline state, the ordinary, unstimulated state, feels increasingly gray and insufficient. This is the baseline problem, and it is the core issue that a dopamine reset is designed to address. When your dopamine baseline has been elevated by chronic overstimulation, ordinary life does not feel ordinary. It feels depleted. Activities that once felt engaging, reading, cooking, exercising, having a conversation, sitting quietly, feel effortful and underwhelming. Not because they have become less valuable, but because your brain is now comparing them against a reference point that has been artificially inflated. The conversation can't compete with the constant novelty of a social media feed. The book can't compete with the visual pace of a streaming series designed by teams of professionals to maximize retention at every minute. The walk in the park can't compete with the stimulation density of a video game. This is how people end up spending hours each day engaged in activities that they don't actually enjoy very much and that leave them feeling vaguely worse afterward. The activities aren't satisfying, but they're sufficiently stimulating to provide relief from the flat, restless feeling of being understimulated, a feeling that only exists because the baseline has been pushed so high. The joylessness signal. There is a particular form of joylessness that many people in the modern world experience but struggle to name or locate the source of. It is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can shade into it. It is more like a dimming, a reduction in the brightness of ordinary experience, a sense that life is being lived slightly behind glass. Things that should feel good feel fine. Things that used to feel exciting feel mildly interesting at best. The capacity for genuine enthusiasm seems to have quietly receded. This is one of the hallmark experiences of an elevated dopamine baseline, and it is frequently mistaken for a personality trait, jaded, cynical, hard to excite, or a consequence of aging when in fact it is a largely reversible state of neurological adaptation. Importantly, this joylessness often coexists with extremely high levels of activity and stimulation. Someone experiencing this might be online for 8 hours a day, consuming enormous amounts of content, and still feel bored and hollow. This seems paradoxical until you understand the baseline mechanism. The activity isn't nourishing. It is merely raising the threshold for what feels like nourishment. The person is not engaging too little with life. They are engaging too much with the wrong kind of stimulation, and the result is a system that is simultaneously overtaxed and undernourished. The analogy that captures this most precisely is dietary. You can eat a very large quantity of food that is high in sugar, low in nutrients, and engineered to defeat satiation, and be simultaneously overfull and malnourished. The volume is there. The nourishment is not. The same dynamic applies to stimulation. You can consume enormous quantities of content and interaction and still feel starved for genuine reward. What a reset does, neurologically, when you reduce high stimulation inputs, when you remove or significantly restrict the engineered dopamine triggers that have been flooding the system, something predictable happens. At first, the system protests. The reduced stimulation feels like deprivation because the baseline is still elevated. This is the discomfort of the first days of any reset, the restlessness, the irritability, the pull toward the things you've put down, the sense that something important is missing. None of this is dangerous. All of it is expected. But over days and weeks, if you hold the reduced stimulation, the brain begins to adjust. Dopamine receptors, relieved of the constant flooding, begin to upregulate, to become more sensitive, not less. The baseline begins to shift back towards something more like its natural set point. And as it does, ordinary activities begin to recover their ability to feel rewarding. This process is not immediate. Research on reward system recalibration suggests that meaningful changes begin to be felt within 1 to 2 weeks, with more substantial shifts occurring over 4 to 6 weeks. This is not a lifetime commitment. It is a finite period of adjustment, one that produces changes that then, with the right habits in place, tend to persist. The goal is not to make you permanently incapable of enjoying high stimulation activities. It is to restore the dynamic range of your reward system, to return to a state where both high-intensity experiences and quiet, ordinary ones register as genuinely rewarding, where you have real choice about what you engage with rather than being pulled by compulsion, and where the feeling of being alive in an ordinary moment is, more often than not, enough. That is not a small thing. That is, by most measures, one of the central elements of a life that feels worth living. Wanting and living. One more implication of Barrage's research deserves attention before we move on. Because dopamine governs wanting, the forward orientation toward the future, a dysregulated dopamine system affects not only how you feel moment to moment but how you relate to time itself. When the wanting system is running on overdrive, the present moment is continuously experienced as a platform for the next thing. You are always slightly ahead of yourself, mentally. Eating dinner while thinking about dessert. In a conversation while planning what to say next. Watching one video while already queuing the next one. The present is perpetually instrumental, a means to the next experience, rather than an experience in itself. This is not a philosophical failing. It is a neurological pattern, and it is one of the most significant quality of life consequences of chronic dopamine flooding. A well-calibrated dopamine system, by contrast, is one that can settle. That can find the current moment sufficient. That does not require constant forward momentum to feel stable. This is not the same as passivity or contentment with stagnation. Motivation and drive are healthy and important. But there is a meaningful difference between motivated engagement with the future and the compulsive inability to inhabit the present. The former is energizing. The latter is exhausting. The reset, ultimately, is also a practice in returning to now. Not as a spiritual concept, but as a neurological reality. When the seeking system is not in overdrive, the present moment becomes accessible in a way it often isn't. This is why people who have completed a successful reset frequently report not just improved focus and productivity but an improved quality of ordinary experience. A sense that life has become, somehow, more vivid. Nothing has changed except the calibration of the instrument through which they perceive it. Practical reflection before reading the next chapter. Spend a few minutes with this exercise. You can do it mentally, or write it down, whichever feels more honest. Identify your top 3 sources of what you might call cheap dopamine, the things you reach for automatically when you're bored, stressed, anxious, or restless. These are not necessarily things you've decided to pursue. They are the things you find yourself doing before you've consciously decided anything. The phone appearing in your hand. The app opening. The snack you weren't hungry for. The video that followed the video you meant to watch. For each one, ask yourself 3 questions. First, when does this happen? What is the trigger that typically precedes it? Second, what does the wanting feel like, and what does the having feel like? Is there a gap between the two? Third, after the activity is over, how do you feel? Better, the same, or slightly worse? You are not trying to change anything yet. You are simply trying to see clearly. Clarity is where the reset begins. The attention economy's war on your mind. According to a 2019 study by Asurian, the average American checks their phone 96 times a day. That is once every 10 minutes across a 16-hour waking day. Another analysis, from researchers at Scout, found that people touch their phones an average of 2,617 times per day, a figure that jumps to over 5,000 for the highest use quartile. A separate study published in the journal PLOS One found that the average person spends roughly 3 hours and 15 minutes on their phone daily, though self-reported estimates run considerably lower than what usage tracking software actually records. Humans are famously poor at estimating their own screen time, consistently underreporting it by 30 to 40%. These numbers are striking enough on their own. But what makes them genuinely significant is not the quantity. It is the architecture behind it. Each one of those 96 daily phone checks is not accidental. It is the intended result of engineering effort that rivals, in its sophistication and precision, the development of any pharmaceutical product. The systems pulling your attention toward a screen were designed by large teams of talented people, informed by decades of behavioral research, and continuously refined using data collected from hundreds of millions of users in real time. They are, in the most literal and non-metaphorical sense, optimized to produce exactly the behavior they produce. Understanding this is not about assigning blame, and it is certainly not about feeling like a helpless victim of sinister forces. It is about accuracy. If you want to change your relationship with your phone, your apps, your feeds, and your screens, the starting point is understanding what you are actually dealing with, and what you are dealing with is not weak willpower. It is a set of deliberately constructed environments designed to exploit the most fundamental operating principles of your nervous system. The business model behind the hijack. To understand why your attention has been so systematically captured, you need to understand the economics that motivate the capture. The dominant business model of the internet, particularly across social media platforms, search engines, and much of the content economy, is advertising. Advertising revenue is determined primarily by one thing: engagement. The more time users spend on a platform, the more advertisements they see, and the more data the platform collects about their behavior, preferences, and psychology, data that can be used to target advertisements with increasing precision. From a business perspective, the ideal user is one who is always on the platform, always engaged, never satisfied enough to stop, and ideally unaware of how much time has passed. This creates an incentive structure that is, when you examine it clearly, fundamentally at odds with the interests of the user. The platform's revenue depends on your continued engagement. Your well-being depends on your capacity to disengage, to put the device down, to focus on other things, to rest, to be present in your own life. These interests are not merely different. They are, in important ways, opposed. Former employees of major tech companies have been candid about this over the years. Tristan Harris, who worked as a design ethicist at Google before co-founding the Center for Humane Technology, described the competitive dynamic among platforms as a race to the bottom of the brainstem, a competition to see who could most effectively exploit the most primitive and automatic responses of the human nervous system. Chamath Palihapitiya, a former Facebook executive, said in a 2017 interview that the company had created tools that are ripping apart the social fabric of how society works, and admitted that he felt tremendous guilt about his role in that process. These are not people speaking in ignorance about the systems they helped build. The mechanisms they built, the likes, the notifications, the feeds, the autoplay functions, were not designed neutrally and then discovered to be addictive. They were designed with the explicit intention of maximizing what the industry calls engagement and what behavioral psychologists call operant conditioning. The vocabulary differs. The mechanism is the same. Variable reward, the slot machine in your pocket. In the 1950s, the American psychologist B.F. Skinner conducted a series of experiments that remain, decades later, among the most consequential in the history of behavioral science. Skinner was studying reinforcement, the way that rewards shape behavior, and he discovered something that seemed almost paradoxical. Animals that were rewarded every time they performed a behavior learned the behavior quickly but also gave it up quickly when the reward stopped. Animals that were rewarded intermittently, sometimes when they performed the behavior, sometimes not, with no predictable pattern, learned more slowly but were extraordinarily resistant to giving up. They would press the lever again and again long after the rewards had ceased entirely. This pattern of intermittent reinforcement is the most powerful schedule for generating persistent behavior ever documented in psychology. And it is the fundamental mechanism behind both gambling and social media engagement. A slot machine does not pay out on every pull. If it did, it would be less compelling, not more. The power of the slot machine is in the uncertainty, the possibility of a reward that might come now, or after 5 more pulls, or after 20. The brain's dopamine system responds powerfully to this uncertainty. When a reward is possible but not certain, dopamine doesn't just respond when the reward arrives. It fires in anticipation of every potential reward moment. Every pull of the lever, every refresh of the feed, every tap of the notification triggers a small dopamine response associated with the possibility of reward. The uncertainty is not a limitation of the system. It is the feature that makes the system work. Social media feeds operate on exactly this schedule. When you open an app and scroll, you genuinely do not know what you will find. Sometimes there is something interesting or pleasing. Sometimes there is something upsetting. Sometimes there is nothing of any significance at all. But the possibility of finding something compelling is always there, and that possibility, reliably, produces a seeking response. The refresh is the pull of the lever. The feed is the slot machine. And the people who designed it studied Skinner. This is not a conspiracy theory or a dramatic metaphor. It is a design choice that has been described openly by the engineers who made it. In the early days of Facebook, Sean Parker, the company's founding president, described the design philosophy explicitly: how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? We give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you more likes and comments. He was describing Skinner's variable reinforcement schedule, applied at scale. The engineering of incompleteness. In the 1920s, a Lithuanian psychologist named Bluma Zygarnik noticed something curious while observing waiters at a cafe in Berlin. The waiters had remarkable memory for the details of orders that had not yet been delivered, the exact specifications, the modifications, the sequence. But once an order was delivered and the interaction was complete, the details vanished from memory almost instantly. Zygarnik later formalized this observation through research: the human mind holds incomplete tasks in a kind of sustained mental activation, returning to them repeatedly in a way that completed tasks are not. The incompleteness itself creates a cognitive tension that keeps the task alive in awareness. This became known as the Zygarnik effect, and it has become one of the most exploited findings in the history of digital product design. Infinite scroll is the most obvious application. Before infinite scroll became standard, websites had pages. You reached the bottom of a page, and there was a natural stopping point, a moment of completion, however minor. The scroll had an end. Infinite scroll eliminates this. There is no bottom. There is no completion. The task can never be finished because it was never designed to finish. The Zeigarnik effect keeps you suspended in a state of incompleteness, which the mind experiences as a mild but persistent pressure to continue. Autoplay performs the same function for video content. Netflix introduced autoplay for sequential episodes and found that it dramatically increased viewing time, not because people were making active choices to continue, but because the default was continuation, and the friction of stopping, actively canceling the autoplay countdown, was higher than the friction of continuing. The incomplete episode, automatically followed by the next, creates an indefinite chain of incomplete tasks, each one adding its Zeigarnik tension to the last. Notifications serve a similar function but through a different mechanism. Each notification is an unresolved question, something happened, and you don't know what it was. The uncertainty activates the seeking response. The notification doesn't need to contain anything important, it needs only to be present. Its presence creates incompleteness, and incompleteness creates the pull toward resolution. This is why disabling notifications, which sounds like a trivial change, often has a disproportionately large effect on the experience of using a device. You aren't just reducing interruptions. You are removing dozens of Zeigarnik triggers from your environment each day. The costs you may not have named. The effects of living in a high-stimulation, attention-captured environment accumulate over time, and many of them are difficult to attribute clearly to their cause because they are gradual, because they affect subjective experience rather than producing visible symptoms, and because the environment that produced them is so ubiquitous that it has come to seem simply like reality. The first and perhaps most discussed consequence is the erosion of sustained attention. Research on attention spans is methodologically contested. The idea that the human attention span has dropped to 8 seconds, below that of a goldfish, is a widely repeated statistic that has been largely discredited as a misreading of a Microsoft Canada report. But the underlying concern is real. Cal Newport, a computer scientist and researcher at Georgetown University, has documented extensively how the constant switching of attention between tasks and devices, what he calls context switching, produces a form of cognitive residue that impairs deep concentration long after the switching has stopped. Gloria Mark's research at the University of California, Irvine, found that it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully regain focused attention after an interruption. If you are checking your phone every 10 minutes, you are never returning to full concentration. You are operating in a permanent state of partial attention. Deep work, the kind of sustained, concentrated cognitive effort that produces genuinely important creative and intellectual output, requires not just uninterrupted time but a nervous system that is capable of settling into sustained focus. A brain habituated to the pace and switching frequency of a high-stimulation environment will resist the settling. The distraction is not coming from the phone on the desk. It is now also coming from inside the mind that has been trained by the phone on the desk. The second major cost is emotional dysregulation. The dopamine flooding produced by social media engagement does not only affect motivation and focus. It affects mood, and it does so in a direction that is, over time, predominantly negative. Social media platforms create what researchers sometimes call upward social comparison at an unprecedented scale and frequency. You are not comparing yourself to the people in your immediate social environment. You are comparing yourself to a curated, edited highlight reel of hundreds of people simultaneously, a sample heavily biased toward achievement, attractiveness, travel, and social success, because these are the kinds of content that generate the most engagement and therefore the most algorithmic amplification. Research consistently links heavy social media use to increased rates of anxiety, depression, and reduced self-esteem, particularly in younger users. The direction of causation has been disputed. It is possible that people who already feel anxious or low are more likely to use social media heavily, but longitudinal studies, as well as experiments in which subjects have had their social media use restricted, suggest that the relationship is bidirectional. Social media makes people feel worse, and people who feel worse use more social media. The loop closes in the wrong direction. The third cost is motivational flattening, the same phenomenon we examined in the previous chapter through the lens of the dopamine baseline, but felt here in its daily practical consequences. When your reward system has been calibrated upward by constant high stimulation activity, the things that require sustained effort for delayed reward exercise, learning a skill, building something, maintaining a relationship, doing difficult work become increasingly unappealing relative to the effortless, immediate gratification of digital consumption. This is not laziness. It is the predictable behavioral outcome of a particular neurological state. The motivation is not absent. It has simply been redirected toward the things that most efficiently trigger the seeking response. Dopamine flooding and the tolerance trap. The concept of tolerance, well understood in the context of substances like alcohol or caffeine, applies equally to behavioral stimuli. When the dopamine system is activated intensely and frequently over extended periods, it downregulates, as we explored in the previous chapter. But the behavioral implications of this downregulation extend beyond the subjective feeling of joylessness. They affect the actual choices you make. When ordinary activities no longer register as adequately stimulating because the baseline has been raised by repeated exposure to high-stimulation digital content, you don't respond by choosing those ordinary activities and sitting with the discomfort. You respond by seeking more stimulation. The person who is bored by a book reaches for their phone. The person who finds conversation insufficiently engaging glances at a screen. The person who cannot sit with a quiet moment fills it. Each of these responses is rational from the perspective of the dopamine system in its current state. Each of them also deepens the tolerance and raises the baseline further. This is the tolerance trap. The more you respond to understimulation by adding stimulation, the more understimulation you create, which requires more stimulation to address, and so on. The exit from the trap is the one thing the trap is specifically designed to prevent: doing less, sitting with the flatness, allowing the system to adjust downward. This is why the early days of a reset are uncomfortable in a way that feels disproportionate to the actual deprivation involved. Putting down your phone for an afternoon should not feel as difficult as it often does. The fact that it does tells you something important about how far the calibration has drifted. Understanding the tolerance trap also helps explain why moderate changes often fail. If you reduce your phone use from 6 hours a day to 5, the dopamine system barely registers the difference. The baseline doesn't shift meaningfully. But if you reduce it substantially, if you remove the major sources of high stimulation input for a period long enough to allow genuine neurological adjustment, the system has room to recalibrate. The change needs to be significant enough to cross a threshold. This is the logic behind the tiered reset protocols in the later chapters of this book. What you are not losing. It is worth pausing here to say something that can get lost in conversations about digital overstimulation. The internet, social media, and digital technology are not inherently bad. They have produced genuine goods: connection across distance, access to information and culture that was previously available only to the privileged few, the ability to find communities of shared interest regardless of geography, tools for creative expression and professional capability that have changed what individuals and small teams are able to accomplish. None of this is illusory. The problem is not the technology. The problem is the specific design choices made within that technology, driven by a particular business model that monetizes engagement above well-being. And the problem is the absence, until recently, of widespread literacy about how these systems work and what they are doing to the nervous systems of the people who use them. You were handed one of the most neurologically potent attention capture systems ever devised without instructions, without warnings, and without a framework for using it in a way that preserved your cognitive and emotional health. That is what this book is attempting to provide, after the fact. Not a rejection of the technology, but a more honest, more informed, more intentional relationship with it. One where you understand the mechanisms at work and can make genuine choices about how and when to engage. That kind of relationship becomes possible once you have reset the system, once the baseline has returned to a level where you can engage with high stimulation content without being captured by it, where you can put the phone down without it feeling like an amputation, where the choice is actually a choice and not the thin, post hoc rationalization of a behavior that was already underway before you knew it was happening. Practical reflection. This exercise is called the 24-hour audit, and the instructions are deliberately minimal. For one full day, tomorrow, or whichever day you choose, observe every time you reach for a digital stimulant. This means your phone, your laptop open for non-work content, a streaming service, a podcast used as a filler for silence, social media in any form. You are not changing anything. You are not judging anything. You are only watching. Notice what precedes the reach. Is it boredom? Stress? A moment of social discomfort? A transition between tasks? A feeling you'd rather not sit with? Notice how long the sessions last. Notice how you feel when you put the device down, relieved, satisfied, vaguely worse, or simply immediately ready for the next one. Carry something to make brief notes if that's useful, a small notebook, or a running note on paper, not your phone. At the end of the day, look at what you've collected. Not to generate shame or make resolutions. Just to see. The audit is not the reset. It is the honest inventory that makes the reset real. Most people who do it are surprised by what they find, not because the numbers are necessarily shocking, but because seeing the patterns clearly, in their own handwriting, is different from vaguely knowing they exist. Seeing is the beginning of change. In the chapters ahead, you will use what you've learned about the neuroscience, about the systems designed to exploit it, and about your own specific patterns to build a reset that fits your actual life. That reset starts not with a rule but with a clear picture of where you are. You now have that picture. The next step is deciding what to do with it. Practical reflection: the 24-hour digital audit. For one complete day, observe and note every instance in which you reach for a digital stimulant: phone, social media, streaming, podcasts used as silence fillers. What were you doing immediately before the reach? What triggered it? How did you feel in the moments before? Bored? Stressed, anxious, restless, fine? How long did the session last? How did you feel when it ended? Better, the same, or marginally worse? Record your observations on paper rather than a digital device. At the end of the day, read through your notes without judgment. You are not yet trying to change anything. You are trying to see clearly. What you see in that one day's honest record is the starting point for everything that follows. How overstimulated are you? Imagine a person sitting across from a close friend at a coffee shop. They haven't seen each other in 3 months. The friend is mid-sentence, telling a story about something that genuinely matters: a difficult diagnosis, a career change, a relationship that ended, and yet, without quite meaning to, the person's eyes drop to their phone. Just a quick check. 40 seconds, maybe less. They look up, smile, and say, "Sorry, you were saying?" The friend finishes the story, but something has shifted. The intimacy contracted slightly. The moment passed. The person at that table isn't a bad friend. They aren't selfish or indifferent. They are, in the most clinical sense of the word, overstimulated. Their nervous system has been tuned over months and years of constant input to expect novelty at a frequency that a human conversation simply cannot provide. The pauses, the transitions, the natural rhythm of someone else's speech, all of it registers, somewhere below conscious awareness, as insufficiently stimulating. The phone isn't an escape. It's a reflex. This chapter is about learning to see that reflex clearly. Not with shame. Not with the performative self-criticism that social media has made its own kind of stimulation. But with the kind of honest, curious attention that actually precedes change. Before you can reset your dopamine baseline, you need to know where you're starting from. And that requires an audit, a clear-eyed look at the domains of your life where overstimulation has quietly taken hold. What overstimulation actually looks like. There is a difference between the causes of overstimulation and its symptoms, and most people only ever see the symptoms. They notice that they're tired but can't sleep. That they're restless but not energized. That they scroll through entertainment options for 20 minutes, choose nothing, and feel vaguely disappointed. That they sit down to read and find, after 3 paragraphs, that their eyes are moving across the words but their mind has gone elsewhere. These are symptoms. The cause is upstream. Overstimulation, at its core, is the result of your brain's reward circuitry being activated at a frequency and intensity that exceeds what the system was built to handle sustainably. As we explored in earlier chapters, dopamine is not a pleasure chemical so much as an anticipation signal. It fires in response to the promise of reward, and it calibrates itself constantly to the environment. When the environment delivers high-intensity stimulation repeatedly and rapidly, the dopamine system adapts. Receptors downregulate. the baseline shifts upward. What was once pleasurable requires more input to generate the same response, and what was once neutral now registers as dull, aversive, or simply invisible. This is not metaphor. This is measurable neurochemistry, documented in research on everything from substance addiction to behavioral compulsions. What makes the modern version of this phenomenon so insidious is that the inputs driving it are largely legal, socially encouraged, and commercially optimized. Nobody checks you into a facility for doom scrolling. Your boss doesn't stage an intervention because you respond to emails at 11 p.m. Your friends don't express concern because you can't sit through a film without your phone nearby. These behaviors have been normalized so thoroughly that their cumulative effect is nearly invisible until the system starts showing signs of strain. The symptoms of a chronically elevated stimulation baseline tend to cluster around a few recognizable patterns. Boredom intolerance is perhaps the most pervasive, the inability to sit with nothing for even a few minutes without reaching for a device, a snack, a distraction of any kind. Closely related is what psychologists call anhedonia, a diminished capacity to experience pleasure from activities that once felt rewarding. The meal tastes flat. The walk feels pointless. The conversation that used to leave you feeling connected now just leaves you tired. Restlessness is another marker, a low-level agitation that makes stillness feel physically uncomfortable, as though you are supposed to be doing something, going somewhere, consuming something. And then there is the peculiar modern condition of feeling simultaneously overstimulated and bored, a kind of jaded hyperarousal that makes everything feel like too much and not enough at the same time. Understanding these as symptoms of a systemic problem, rather than personal failings or character flaws, is the first important reorientation. You are not lazy. You are not broken. You have a nervous system that has adapted, quite efficiently, to the conditions you have given it. The question is whether those conditions are actually serving you. The 5 domains of overstimulation doesn't arrive through a single channel. It accumulates across multiple areas of daily life, and its total effect, what we might call your stimulation load, is the sum of all of them working together. To assess where you stand honestly, it helps to look at each domain separately before adding them up. The first domain is digital consumption, and it is typically the most significant for most people in the developed world. This includes not just social media and video platforms, but the entire ecosystem of habitual device use, news feeds, messaging apps, email, podcasts, online shopping, gaming, and the ambient background of notifications that punctuate every hour of the day. Research from the Reuters Institute and various media consumption studies consistently finds that adults in high-income countries spend between 6 and 9 hours per day in front of screens, and that figure often underestimates passive background exposure. The relevant question here isn't just quantity but quality. How much of your digital consumption is intentional, and how much is reflexive? How often do you pick up your phone without a specific purpose, scroll without any particular goal, and put it down having gained nothing you can name? The second domain is food and substance stimulants. This one often gets overlooked in conversations about overstimulation because it feels separate from the digital and behavioral patterns we typically discuss. But caffeine, sugar, alcohol, nicotine, and recreational stimulants all interact with the dopamine system in ways that compound the overall load. Caffeine, the world's most widely consumed psychoactive substance, works partly by blocking adenosine receptors, but at high doses and in habitual use patterns, it also influences dopamine signaling and contributes to the cycle of artificial arousal and subsequent crash. Sugar has been shown in animal models to activate the same reward pathways as other addictive substances, though the human picture is more complex. Alcohol, despite being a depressant, initially stimulates dopamine release, which is part of why it feels socially lubricating. None of these substances are inherently problematic in moderation, but they matter in an audit because they add to the total stimulation load in ways that most people don't account for. The third domain is work and busyness addiction. This is perhaps the most socially rewarded form of overstimulation, which makes it the hardest to see. The professional who works 12-hour days, who schedules meetings back-to-back with no transition time, who checks email on vacation and feels guilty when they're idle, this person is not simply hardworking. Research on what's sometimes called busyness as a status symbol, explored by sociologist Sylvia Bellezza and her colleagues, suggests that in contemporary Western culture, being perpetually busy has become a form of social signaling, a marker of importance and worth. But from a neurological standpoint, chronic busyness produces the same dopamine-driven arousal loop as other compulsive behaviors. The urgency, the problem-solving, the constant minor rewards of completing tasks and responding to messages, these create a stimulation pattern that makes genuine rest feel threatening rather than restorative. The clearest sign that busyness has become an addiction is discomfort with unstructured time, the person who doesn't know what to do with themselves on a Saturday afternoon, who fills every gap with productivity, and who feels vaguely anxious when there is nothing demanding their attention. The fourth domain is social and comparison stimulation. Human beings are profoundly social animals, and social engagement naturally activates the dopamine system. We are wired to care about status, connection, and how we're perceived by others. What social media has done is take that wiring and amplify it to a frequency and scale that has no natural precedent. You can now, at any moment, compare your life to hundreds of curated versions of other people's lives, receive public validation or its absence in the form of likes and comments, and monitor your social standing in real time. This isn't just emotionally exhausting. It's neurologically activating in ways that compound the overall stimulation load. Research by Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt on adolescents, and increasingly extended to adults, suggests that heavy social media use correlates with elevated anxiety and diminished well-being, partly through precisely this mechanism of constant social comparison and status monitoring. The fifth domain is entertainment consumption. This is the broadest category: television, film, music, podcasts, books, games, sports, and the most varied in quality. Not all entertainment is equally stimulating, and some forms of engaged, attentive consumption, reading a novel, watching a film you're genuinely absorbed in, can be restorative rather than depleting. The problem arises with passive, high-stimulation, algorithmically optimized entertainment that is designed specifically to override your attention and keep you watching. Streaming platforms use techniques borrowed from variable ratio reinforcement schedules, the same psychological mechanism behind slot machines, to make the next episode autoplay before you've consciously decided to watch it. The entertainment landscape has shifted from content you choose to content that chooses you, and the difference matters enormously for the stimulation load it generates. The concept of stimulation load: think of your nervous system as having a daily capacity for stimulation, a kind of bucket that fills throughout the day. Every dopamine triggering input you encounter adds to the bucket: the phone check first thing in the morning, the coffee, the news headline, the Slack notification, the decision meeting, the scroll at lunch, the podcast during the commute, the evening wine, the series episode, the late night social media check. Each of these inputs is small in isolation. Together, they may add up to a bucket that is perpetually overflowing. The stimulation load concept is useful because it explains why you can feel exhausted and wired simultaneously, or why a quiet weekend alone can feel more stressful than a busy work week. Your nervous system has come to expect a certain level of input to feel normal. Below that level, something feels wrong: too quiet, too still, vaguely threatening. This is the shifted baseline in action. You are not seeking stimulation because it feels good. You are seeking it because the absence of it has come to feel bad. This is a crucial distinction. It means that much of what you experience as preference or desire is actually the sensation of baseline deprivation, the system seeking its new normal, which is elevated above what would serve you best. When you understand this, the audit stops being about identifying your bad habits and starts being about measuring the distance between your current baseline and a healthier one. Signs your baseline has shifted before you begin the formal audit. It helps to recognize the less obvious signs that your dopamine baseline has moved upward from where it should be. These are the quieter, subtler signals that often predate the more obvious symptoms. The clearest sign is boredom. Intolerance, specifically, the inability to tolerate boredom even briefly without acting on it. A well-regulated nervous system can sit in a waiting room without a phone, can take a shower without mental noise, can eat a meal in silence without it feeling punishing. These moments of low-stimulation pause are actually important. They are when the brain consolidates information, generates spontaneous thought, and recovers from the metabolic cost of sustained attention. If you find these moments unbearable rather than neutral, that is a signal. Closely related is difficulty being alone with your thoughts. This is different from introversion or extroversion. It's about whether the inside of your own head has become an uncomfortable place to spend time. People with elevated stimulation baselines often report that their thoughts feel chaotic or relentless when there's nothing to drown them out, which is part of why silence feels aversive. The mind, in the absence of external input, generates its own rumination, anxiety, restlessness, a kind of internal noise that feels worse than the external noise they've grown used to. Emotional numbness is another marker that often goes unrecognized as overstimulation. It presents not as depression in the clinical sense, but as a kind of flatness, a sense that things that should feel meaningful don't quite land. Good news doesn't fully register. A beautiful day feels like a backdrop rather than something to be in. A film or book that would once have moved you passes over you without leaving much. This is anhedonia, and while it has multiple causes, a chronically overstimulated dopamine system is among the most common contributors in otherwise healthy adults. Finally, there is what might be called the novelty imperative, the compulsive need for things to be new, interesting, or surprising in order to hold your attention. This shows up in relationships, the fear that long-term partnerships are inherently boring, in work, the difficulty sustaining effort on projects that are no longer new, in entertainment, the ever-shorter cycle of consuming and discarding, and in daily life, the diminished pleasure in things that are familiar, comfortable, or quiet. When novelty becomes a need rather than a pleasure, your baseline has shifted. How the audit works. The audit you're about to do is not a diagnostic instrument in the clinical sense. It will not produce a score that means you have a disorder or need treatment. What it will do is give you a clear picture of where your stimulation load is highest, which is the information you need to make meaningful changes rather than vague resolutions. For each of the 5 domains, digital consumption, food and substance stimulants, work and busyness, social and comparison stimulation, and entertainment consumption, you will rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. A score of 1 represents a domain where your consumption is intentional, moderate, and doesn't interfere with your capacity to enjoy low stimulation activities. A score of 10 represents a domain where your behavior is largely compulsive, where you notice significant discomfort when the stimulation is absent, and where the domain is clearly affecting your mood, attention, or well-being. The goal is not to score as low as possible. The goal is to score honestly. Underrating your digital consumption because you think social media isn't that bad for you doesn't help you. Overrating your coffee intake because you feel guilty about it doesn't either. Approach each question with the same neutral curiosity you might bring to a medical history. This is information, not judgment. Once you have your scores, identify your 2 highest load domains. These are your primary targets for the reset work in subsequent chapters. They are not your worst failures. They are the highest leverage points, the places where moderate changes will produce the largest shift in your overall stimulation baseline. It's worth noting that domains often interact. High digital consumption and high entertainment consumption frequently co-occur and mutually reinforce each other. Busyness addiction and substance stimulants, particularly caffeine and alcohol, are commonly paired, the caffeine to drive the busyness, the alcohol to come down from it. Seeing these connections isn't about finding patterns to criticize yourself with. It's about understanding the architecture of your stimulation habits so you can intervene intelligently rather than randomly. The audit is a starting point, not a verdict. There is a particular kind of reader who will approach this audit with a preformed conclusion, either "I'm not that bad, really," or "I knew I was a mess." Both of these postures are ways of avoiding the actual information. The person who minimizes is protecting habits they don't want to examine. The person who catastrophizes is using shame as a substitute for action, self-flagellation that feels like accountability but produces no change. The invitation here is to be genuinely curious. You have a nervous system that has adapted to your conditions. Those conditions are, in large part, the result of a culture that was not designed with your neurological well-being in mind. Understanding how you got here is not the same as excusing where you are. It is simply the most accurate way to begin. The audit is a starting point. It tells you where you are. The chapters that follow will show you how to get somewhere else, not through deprivation or white-knuckled willpower, but through the gradual, sustainable recalibration of a system that is more resilient than it might feel right now. Practical reflection. This exercise takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Find somewhere quiet, put your phone in another room, and give your honest attention to each question. Score each domain from 1 to 10, where 1 is low concern and 10 is high concern. Then write 2 to 3 sentences after each score explaining why you chose it. The explanation matters more than the number. Domain 1, digital consumption. How much of your daily phone and screen use is intentional versus reflexive? Do you check your phone within the first 30 minutes of waking? Do you feel anxious or restless when you're without your phone for an hour or more? Do you find yourself scrolling without a clear goal on a daily basis? Your score, 1 to 10. Your explanation. Domain 2, food and substance stimulants. How much do you rely on caffeine, sugar, alcohol, or other substances to regulate your energy and mood throughout the day? Do you use stimulants to get started and depressants to come down? Would removing coffee or alcohol for a week feel like a significant hardship? Your score, 1 to 10. Your explanation. Domain 3, work and busyness. How comfortable are you with genuinely unstructured time with no productivity goal attached? Do you feel guilty when you're idle? Do you check work email outside of work hours regularly? Is being busy central to how you think about your worth or identity? Your score, 1 to 10. Your explanation. Domain 4, social and comparison stimulation. How much time do you spend monitoring how others perceive you or comparing your life to others online? Do you feel worse about your own life after spending time on social media? Do you seek validation through likes, responses, or external feedback more than feels comfortable to admit? Your score, 1 to 10. Your explanation. Domain 5, entertainment consumption. How often do you watch, listen to, or play something primarily to avoid sitting with nothing rather than because you genuinely want to engage with it? Do you autoplay the next episode without deciding to? Is your entertainment consumption intentional, or is it largely filling silence? Your score, 1 to 10. Your explanation. Once you have your 5 scores and explanations, circle your 2 highest. These are the domains you'll focus on first. Write a single sentence for each, not a plan, not a resolution, just an honest acknowledgement. This is where I am. That sentence is the beginning. Why You Can't Think Anymore. In 2004, Gloria Mark, a professor of informatics at the University of California, Irvine, planted observers in offices and had them track how long workers could sustain attention on a single task before switching to something else. The average, at the time, was about 2.5 minutes. She repeated the study years later, as smartphones became ubiquitous and notification culture became the wallpaper of professional life. By then, the average had dropped to around 47 seconds. 47 seconds. Not per task, per uninterrupted stretch of attention before switching to something else. Across a full workday, this means most knowledge workers never sustain a continuous thread of thought long enough to reach the level of depth where genuinely complex thinking occurs. They skim the surface of dozens of tasks, problems, and conversations without ever diving to the bottom of any of them. And when they leave the office, the same pattern follows them home. To the dinner table, to the conversation with their children, to the book on the nightstand that has had a bookmark at the same page for 3 weeks. This is not laziness. It is not a generational failing or a character defect. It is a measurable, neurologically grounded consequence of how we have restructured the conditions under which human attention operates. Understanding what is actually happening in your brain, not just the behavior but the mechanism, is the first step toward doing something about it. The architecture of attention. Your capacity for sustained, directed focus is headquartered in the prefrontal cortex, the large, evolutionarily recent region of the brain that sits behind your forehead. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for what neuroscientists call executive function, the ability to hold a goal in mind, resist competing impulses, sustain effort over time, and filter out irrelevant information. It is, in a very real sense, the seat of your intentional self, the part of you that can decide what to pay attention to and then actually do it. The prefrontal cortex is also extraordinarily metabolically expensive. Neurons in this region require substantial glucose and oxygen to maintain sustained firing patterns, which is why concentrated mental effort feels fatiguing in a way that passive activity doesn't. More importantly for our purposes, the prefrontal cortex is exquisitely sensitive to the state of the dopamine system. It has dense populations of dopamine receptors, particularly D1 receptors, that are critical to its functioning. Moderate, well-regulated dopamine signaling in the prefrontal cortex actually enhances its function, attention sharpens, working memory improves, and the ability to resist distraction strengthens. But when dopamine signaling is dysregulated, either too low or too high, prefrontal function degrades. The cortex becomes less effective at suppressing distraction, at holding goals in mind, at resisting the pull of novelty-seeking behavior. This is the mechanism at the heart of the modern focus crisis. It is not that people have simply decided to be inattentive. It is that chronic overstimulation has produced a dopamine environment in the brain that actively undermines the prefrontal cortex's ability to do its job. The brain that has been conditioned to expect constant novelty is a brain that has difficulty tolerating the sustained, unrewarded effort that deep thinking requires, because deep thinking is, by definition, slow, effortful, and largely devoid of the rapid dopamine hits that the conditioned system has come to demand. How dopamine flooding undermines focus. The relationship between dopamine and attention is more nuanced than popular accounts suggest. Dopamine doesn't simply make you feel good or bad, it shapes what your brain treats as worth pursuing. At a well-calibrated baseline, the dopamine system functions as a filter, helping the prefrontal cortex distinguish between signals worth attending to and noise worth ignoring. When you see your phone light up with a notification while you're trying to write a report, a well-functioning prefrontal cortex, supported by healthy dopamine signaling, can evaluate that notification as low priority and return attention to the task. The system works. When dopamine signaling is chronically elevated and dysregulated, this filter breaks down. The threshold for worth attending to drops dramatically, because the reward circuitry has been tuned to expect and seek novelty at high frequency. Everything becomes potentially interesting. Every interruption carries the promise of a small reward. The phone doesn't just pull at your attention, it pulls with a force that the weakened prefrontal cortex cannot reliably override. And critically, every time you give in to that pull, you reinforce the neural pathway that makes it more likely you'll give in again. This is the feedback loop that makes modern distractions so difficult to fight with willpower alone. The repeated act of switching attention in response to low-level stimulation literally reshapes the neural circuits responsible for attention, making sustained focus progressively harder even in environments where there is nothing to be distracted by. The brain has learned to distract itself. It has come to treat the drift from task to stimulus as the default mode, and sustained attention as the exception that requires effortful override. Research on ADHD provides some illuminating context here. One of the neurological features of attention deficit disorders is dysregulated dopamine signaling in the prefrontal cortex, specifically, reduced dopamine receptor sensitivity that makes it harder for the cortex to exert the inhibitory control necessary for sustained attention. What's striking about the current moment is that the behavioral patterns encouraged by modern technology produce dopamine dynamics that superficially resemble this profile in neurotypical people. This is not to say that everyone who can't focus has ADHD, but it suggests that the conditions we've created are capable of generating attention difficulties in people who wouldn't otherwise have them, through the same underlying mechanisms. Attention residue, the hidden cost of every switch. Gloria Mark's research didn't just document how frequently people switch tasks. It also revealed something more troubling: the cognitive cost of those switches doesn't disappear when you return to the original task. She called this phenomenon attention residue, the mental fragments of a previous task that remain active in working memory even after you've nominally moved on, degrading your performance on whatever you're doing next. When you pause a report to check Twitter, then return to the report, part of your cognitive load is still processing Twitter, whatever you saw, felt, or thought while scrolling. It lingers, occupying mental bandwidth that should be available for the report. The more frequent the switches, and the more emotionally or cognitively engaging the interruptions, the more severe the residue. Mark's research found that it can take more than 20 minutes to return to a state of deep focus after a significant interruption, which means that in a workday punctuated by constant notifications, many people never return to that state at all. This helps explain the widespread experience of finishing a full workday and feeling as though you've accomplished nothing substantial. You've been busy. You've responded to things, attended meetings, moved through a list of tasks. But you haven't thought. You've processed inputs and generated outputs without the sustained, connected reasoning that produces insight, creativity, or genuine problem solving. The work has been shallow, not because you're incapable of deep work, but because the conditions, both external, the notifications, the open office, the culture of availability, and internal, the conditioned attention system, have made it nearly inaccessible. Attention residue also accumulates across the day, which is why many people find that their capacity for concentrated thought is at its lowest in the afternoon and evening, even after a full night's sleep. The residue from a morning of fragmented attention degrades the afternoon's capacity before you've even added the new switches of the second half of the day. The myth of multitasking. Somewhere in the 1990s and early 2000s, multitasking became a virtue. It appeared on resumes. It was celebrated in management literature. It was held up as the hallmark of the modern, adaptive professional. Neuroscience has since clarified that it was never real. The human brain does not multitask. It switches. And it switches at a cost. The research of cognitive psychologist David Meyer, among others, established clearly that what we experience as parallel processing, doing two things simultaneously, is actually rapid sequential switching between tasks, and that each switch carries a task switching cost, a measurable degradation in speed and accuracy that occurs every time the brain has to redirect its attentional resources. The more cognitively demanding the tasks, the higher the cost. Writing an email while listening to a podcast is not doing two things at once. It is doing each of them worse than you would do them separately, with the additional penalty of depleted attention capacity that accumulates over the course of the switch-laden day. What makes this particularly relevant to the dopamine story is that the experience of switching often feels productive. There is a small dopamine reward in novelty, in the sense of motion, in the stimulation of managing multiple streams simultaneously. Multitasking feels efficient because the dopamine system rewards the switching behavior, not the quality of the output. You can spend an afternoon in this state of manic, pleasurable, constantly switching busyness and produce work that is embarrassingly thin, while feeling as though you worked hard. The feeling and the reality diverge completely, and the dopamine system is responsible for the gap. The disappearance of the boredom window. There is something we have lost in the last decade that we haven't properly mourned, partly because it didn't feel like a loss at the time. It felt like progress. For most of human history, boredom was unavoidable. There were gaps in the day, the commute, the waiting room, the lull between tasks, the 15 minutes before dinner where the mind had nothing particular to do. These gaps were not wasted time. They were, neurologically, essential time. Research on the default mode network, the brain system that activates during mind-wandering, daydreaming, and undirected thought, suggests that these states of low-directed attention are when the brain performs some of its most important work. Consolidating memories. Making non-obvious connections between ideas. Processing emotional experiences. Generating the spontaneous insights that, in the organizational psychology literature, often appear to subjects as having arrived from nowhere but can be traced to the latent processing that occurred during periods of apparent mental drift. The smartphone has almost entirely eliminated this window. The boredom that used to arrive in the gap between subway stops now meets a phone before it has a chance to bloom into anything. The restlessness that used to produce a stray thought, a novel connection, a moment of creative drift is now immediately medicated with a scroll. We have substituted external stimulation for internal processing, and we have done it so consistently and so completely that many people have genuinely forgotten what the unmedicated boredom window feels like or that it was ever worth having. The consequences for cognitive life are significant. The spontaneous creative thought that used to emerge from downtime has been crowded out. The emotional processing that needed quiet to happen gets deferred indefinitely. The sense of mental spaciousness that used to characterize weekends and vacations, the feeling that your mind had room to roam, has been replaced by the same compressed, switch-heavy mental texture that characterizes the workweek. There is nowhere left to recover, because recovery requires boredom, and boredom has been made intolerable by conditioning. Deep work and why we've lost access to it. Cal Newport, the computer scientist and author who has written most clearly about this territory, makes a distinction that is worth dwelling on. Deep work is the state of cognitively demanding, distraction-free concentration that produces your best thinking and most valuable output. Shallow work is everything else: the emails, the meetings, the administrative tasks, the quick responses and routine processes that have to happen but don't require or benefit from your deepest attention. Newport's argument, developed across his research and writing, is that deep work is both increasingly rare in contemporary professional life and increasingly valuable in an economy that rewards complex problem-solving, creative synthesis, and genuine expertise, and that these two facts are directly related. We have built a professional culture that structurally undermines the capacity most necessary for excellent knowledge work. What Newport describes in cultural and professional terms, the neuroscience of dopamine and attention illuminates in mechanistic terms. Deep work is not simply a matter of allocating time to focused tasks. It requires a nervous system that can tolerate the discomfort of not switching. It requires an attention system whose default pull is towards sustained engagement rather than novelty seeking. It requires a prefrontal cortex that has not been weakened by chronic dopamine dysregulation. And it requires, critically, the willingness to sit in a state of effort that feels unrewarded for extended periods, trusting that the output will be worth the sustained attention. This is precisely what high-stimulation habits make difficult. When your baseline has been elevated by constant digital input, the relative dullness of deep work, the long minutes of reading a difficult text, the slow process of working through a complex argument, the extended effort of writing something careful and true feels intolerable not because it is objectively unpleasant, but because it cannot compete with the dopamine-spiking alternatives that your brain has learned to prefer. The focused work loses out not on its merits but on neurochemical grounds. This is also why the advice to just turn off your phone and focus fails most people most of the time. The problem is not the phone. The phone is a symptom. The problem is an attention system that has been conditioned to resist the sustained engagement that deep work requires. Removing the device without addressing the underlying conditioning is like telling someone with a sugar addiction to simply stop eating candy, technically possible by force of will, but not a solution to what's actually happening. What recovery looks like: the focus system is not permanently damaged. This is important to understand, because the hopelessness that sometimes accompanies recognizing how impaired your attention has become is itself a barrier to doing something about it. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself in response to new conditions, applies to the attention system as much as it applies to any other neural function. The circuits that have been trained toward distraction can be retrained toward sustained engagement. The prefrontal cortex that has been weakened by chronic dopamine dysregulation can recover function as the dopamine environment is gradually recalibrated. But the recovery requires something counterintuitive: deliberate, sustained exposure to the very experience that overstimulation has made aversive. Boredom practice, intentional, purposeful periods of doing nothing, is one of the most undervalued cognitive interventions available. This doesn't mean meditation, necessarily, though meditation addresses some of the same mechanisms. It means allowing the gaps to exist: the commute without the podcast, the lunch without the phone, the evening walk without the audiobook. It means sitting with the discomfort of an unoccupied mind long enough for the discomfort to pass and something else to emerge. What emerges, as the default mode network is allowed to activate without competition, is often surprising: a thought you hadn't had, a connection between ideas you'd been holding separately, a sense of mental spaciousness that you may have forgotten was possible. Distraction fasting, structured periods of time away from high stimulation inputs, is the other half of the recovery equation. Not a single digital detox weekend, which is about as effective for rewiring attention habits as a single good meal is for improving nutritional health, but a sustained reduction in the frequency and intensity of stimulation inputs over weeks and months. The goal is to lower the stimulation baseline enough that the activities that currently feel dull, the book, the conversation, the difficult project, can reclaim their natural appeal. The research here, though still emerging, is encouraging. Studies on attention restoration, the process by which directed attention fatigue is relieved, involuntary focus is recovered, consistently show that low stimulation, naturalistic environments, what researchers Kaplan and Kaplan called soft fascination, the gentle, involuntary attention captured by nature, open space, and quiet, are highly effective at restoring the attentional resources that directed focus depletes. The implication is that the brain wants to recover, given the right conditions. The question is whether we're willing to create them. A note on diagnosis versus performance: the exercise at the end of this chapter is diagnostic, not evaluative. The goal is not to discover how focused you are, or to impress yourself, or to prove you can do it. The goal is to observe what happens when you try to gather real information about the state of your attention system and what it encounters when asked to sustain effort without distraction. What you will likely notice, if you approach the exercise honestly, is a sequence. There will be an initial period of settling, perhaps a few minutes, where the absence of stimulation feels mildly uncomfortable. Then there may be the arising of thoughts about other things you could or should be doing. Then, if you hold the task, something shifts, the discomfort eases, the task begins to draw more of your attention, the mind starts to engage rather than resist. This shift, from resistance to engagement, is the hinge point of deep focus. It is the moment the prefrontal cortex exerts its influence and the novelty-seeking impulse quiets. But you cannot get to the hinge point by switching. Every time you give in to the pull to check the phone, to open a tab, to let the mind fully drift to a different task, you reset to the beginning of the sequence. This is what attention residue means in practice. The cost of the switch is not just the time you spent away, but the time you spend returning. Understanding this helps transform how you think about distraction. The phone check in the middle of a focused task isn't a small moment of relief. It is the beginning of a 20-minute recovery cycle, during which your best thinking is unavailable to you. Seeing it this way, not as a moral failure but as a neurological transaction with a real cost, gives you a more accurate and more useful framework for making different choices. Practical reflection: set a timer for 20 minutes. Choose one task that requires genuine thinking: writing something, reading a difficult text, working through a problem, drafting an idea. Put your phone in another room, close all browser tabs except what you need, and begin. Your only job for those 20 minutes is to stay with the task. Not to perform brilliantly. Not to produce anything polished. Simply to observe what happens in your mind when you ask it to sustain attention without relief. Keep a small piece of paper nearby. Use it only to note what arises. When did you first feel the pull to switch or check something? What was the character of that pull? Physical restlessness, a specific thought about something else, a general vague unease, something else? At what point, if any, did the resistance ease and the task start to absorb you? What did it feel like in your body when the pull was strongest? When the timer ends, do not evaluate your performance. You were not being tested on focus. You were gathering data about your current attention system, where it is, not where it should be. Write 2 or 3 sentences about what you noticed. Not about what you accomplished, but about what your mind did. This is the baseline. Everything in the reset process builds from here, and honesty about where you're starting is more valuable than any performance you could manage. The pull you felt was real. The difficulty was real. And the fact that those 20 minutes felt harder than they should is the most useful piece of information this chapter can give you, because it tells you exactly what you're working to restore. Why nothing feels worth doing. There is a peculiar kind of suffering that has no name in everyday language. It is not depression, exactly, you are not sad. It is not laziness, you know how to work, and you have worked before. It is something closer to a dimming. The things that once pulled at you: a book you wanted to finish, a project you meant to start, a run you kept postponing, a friendship you kept meaning to invest in, no longer pull. They sit there in your awareness like objects behind glass. You can see them. You can even remember wanting them. But the wanting itself has gone quiet. You pick up your phone instead, not because it is better, but because at least it registers. At least something happens. This is not a character flaw. It is not a sign that you have finally discovered your true, apathetic self after years of pretending otherwise. It is a physiological state, one that is measurable, explicable, and reversible. And it has a precise mechanism: the overcalibration of your brain's dopamine system toward effortless, high-stimulation rewards, at the expense of everything else. We live in the most stimulating era in human history. The average person in 2024 consumes more information in a single day than a person in the 15th century would encounter in their entire lifetime. We have access to more entertainment, more food variety, more social interaction, more novelty than any previous generation could have imagined. And yet the data on motivation paints a troubling picture. Rates of chronic boredom are rising across demographics. Engagement at work has declined steadily for decades. Young adults report lower rates of pursuing hobbies than at any point in recorded survey history. Rates of anhedonia, the clinical term for the inability to feel pleasure, have increased in parallel with smartphone adoption. This is not irony. It is causation. The very abundance of stimulation is what is making everything feel flat. The engine behind wanting to understand why motivation breaks down: you first need to understand what motivation actually is, neurologically speaking. Most people assume dopamine is the pleasure chemical, the thing that makes you feel good when something good happens. This is partially true, but it misses the more important part of the story. Dopamine, as neuroscientist Kent Barrage and his colleagues demonstrated through decades of research at the University of Michigan, is primarily a chemical of wanting, not liking. Barrage's famous experiments with rats in the 1990s showed that blocking dopamine receptors did not stop rats from enjoying food. They would still show positive reactions to sweet tastes when food was placed directly in their mouths. But it completely eliminated their motivation to seek food. They would starve to death surrounded by food they could still enjoy, simply because they no longer wanted it. This distinction, wanting versus liking, is one of the most important and underappreciated findings in modern neuroscience. The dopamine system does not primarily reward you after an experience. It drives you toward the experience before it happens. It initiates. It generates the anticipatory pull that makes you get up, take action, pursue. Without healthy dopamine signaling, starting things becomes almost impossibly difficult, not because you cannot do them once started, but because the initiating impulse is gone. This is why people in states of dopamine depletion or low receptor sensitivity often report that they can sometimes get into activities once their going flow can still emerge, but the activation energy required to begin feels enormous. The couch is not more comfortable than it used to be. The blank page is not more daunting. The first step of a run is not more physically difficult. But the internal signal that says start this, it will be worth it, has become so faint that it barely registers. What determines the strength of that signal? Largely, your dopamine baseline and receptor sensitivity, which are, in turn, shaped by what you have been feeding your dopamine system. When the scale is broken, think of your brain's reward system as a precision instrument designed to assign relative value to activities. In a natural environment, the one your nervous system evolved for, the scale needed to distinguish between subtle rewards. The satisfaction of finding berries. The pleasure of warmth after cold. The reward of a conversation that deepened a relationship. The quiet completion of a physical task. These were the kinds of inputs the scale was calibrated to measure. Now imagine flooding that scale with signals that are orders of magnitude stronger than anything it evolved to handle. 1,000 likes on a photo. A gambling mechanism engineered by a team of psychologists deployed directly into your palm. Food designed in a laboratory to hit the exact combination of fat, salt, and sugar that maximizes dopamine response. Entertainment paced at a cut per second rate that prevents the attention system from settling long enough to feel neutral. The instrument recalibrates. It has to. Chronic exposure to extreme stimulation causes the brain to compensate through two mechanisms that neuroscientists call downregulation. First, reducing the number of dopamine receptors available, so that the same amount of dopamine produces less effect, and second, reducing the baseline firing rate of dopamine-producing neurons, making the system less reactive overall. These are protective adaptations, designed to prevent the system from being overwhelmed. But they come at a cost. Once the scale has recalibrated around extreme inputs, moderate inputs barely move the needle. And moderate inputs are exactly what real life is made of. Finishing a report. Having a genuine conversation. Taking a walk. Cooking a meal. Reading a chapter. These activities produce genuine dopamine responses, they always have. But if your baseline has shifted upward due to chronic overstimulation, those responses fall below your threshold of perceived reward. They don't feel worth doing. Not because they aren't, but because your measurement system is broken. Researchers sometimes call this the effort discount problem. Every activity has a cost, the effort required to do it, and a perceived reward. Normally, the brain performs a rough calculation: is the reward worth the effort? When the reward system is miscalibrated, activities with genuine but moderate rewards get systematically undervalued. The denominator of effort stays the same, but the numerator of perceived reward shrinks. And when the math no longer adds up, motivation evaporates. Anhedonia, the grayness that settles in anhedonia, is a clinical term with a deceptively dry definition: the inability to feel pleasure. But the lived experience of it is far more textured and subtle than that definition suggests, particularly in its mild to moderate forms, the forms that most people walking around in the modern world are experiencing without realizing it has a name. The hallmark of anhedonia is not sadness. Sadness is sharp, it has an object. You feel sad about something. Anhedonia is more like the emotional equivalent of turning down the contrast on a screen. Things still happen, but they happen in a slightly flatter register. A piece of music that used to give you chills now just plays. A meal you loved now just feeds you. A conversation that would have felt electric now just passes time. You might still function well. You might even, from the outside, appear to be doing fine. But there is a persistent sense that the color has drained out of things. In severe forms, anhedonia is a diagnostic criterion for major depression. But in its subclinical forms, sometimes called hedonic blunting, it is extraordinarily common and almost entirely underrecognized. A 2023 survey published in the journal Frontiers in Psychiatry found that subclinical anhedonia was reported by nearly 40% of adults under 50, with rates significantly higher among heavy smartphone users. The mechanism is precisely what you would expect given what you now know about dopamine. When the reward system is chronically flooded with high stimulation inputs and downregulates accordingly, the result is not just a reduced response to extreme stimuli. The entire curve shifts. Even activities that were once robustly rewarding, meaningful ones, hard-won ones, the ones you actually care about, no longer generate enough dopamine signal to register as pleasurable. The feeling of "this is worth doing" is a neurochemical event. When the chemistry is off, the feeling doesn't come. What makes this particularly insidious is the interpretation. When you lose interest in things you used to love, the most natural conclusion is that you have simply grown out of them, or that you were wrong to love them, or that you are a different, less enthusiastic person than you once were. The story you tell yourself is one of maturation or disillusionment. The truth is more mechanical. Your reward circuitry has been recalibrated by pattern of use, and the recalibration can be reversed. The procrastination mechanism. There is a specific manifestation of the motivation trap that most people recognize immediately, even if they have never connected it to dopamine, the procrastination loop. You have a task. You know you should do it. You might even want to do it, in some abstract, time-delayed sense. And instead of doing it, you pick up your phone. You scroll. An hour passes. You feel worse about the task, more anxious, more behind. And you scroll again. This is not a failure of willpower in any meaningful sense. It is a direct consequence of the dopamine calculus happening in your brain. Scrolling social media or news feeds is an extremely high dopamine activity, not because the content is particularly satisfying, but because of its structural design. Variable reward schedules, the same mechanism that makes slot machines maximally addictive, are baked into every major platform. You don't know if the next scroll will give you something interesting, mildly amusing, or completely inert, and that unpredictability is precisely what makes the dopamine response so robust. Starting a real task, writing the first sentence, opening the spreadsheet, beginning the workout has a very different dopamine profile. There is typically a brief dip in perceived reward at the moment of initiation, before flow or genuine engagement begins. The first minute of a run is often the worst. The first paragraph of an essay often comes with resistance. This initiation dip is a known neurological phenomenon. The reward signal hasn't yet caught up with the activity. Your brain is asking for payment up front before delivering the reward. When your dopamine system is calibrated to the extreme highs of variable digital reward, that initiation dip feels catastrophic by comparison. The gap between the immediate experience of starting something real and the immediate experience of scrolling your feed is not just the difference between good and neutral, it is the difference between good and unacceptably bad. And your brain, which is fundamentally an optimization machine, keeps choosing the option that feels better right now. This is why simply deciding to procrastinate less, or knowing that you should start, or feeling guilty about not starting, none of these things reliably change behavior. The decision-making is not happening at the level of conscious choice. It is happening at the level of neurochemical comparison, before the prefrontal cortex has a chance to intervene. Changing the behavior requires changing the calibration, not strengthening the willpower. The accumulation effect a single day of heavy social media use does not permanently recalibrate your reward system. But a single day is not the unit of analysis that matters. What matters is the pattern years of daily choices that consistently favor high stimulation, low effort rewards over low stimulation, high effort, delayed reward activities. Every time you choose scrolling over starting, every time you choose the Algorithmically optimized entertainment over the slower satisfaction of making something. Every time you reach for the easy hit instead of sitting with the friction of beginning something meaningful, you are casting a vote for a particular calibration of your reward system. The votes accumulate. The brain, which is profoundly plastic, responds to patterns of use. This is the accumulation effect. It is not dramatic, it does not happen overnight. But over months and years, the gradual drift of baseline expectations, receptor sensitivity, and what the brain registers as worth the effort creates a landscape where real activities feel increasingly unrewarding and digital/junk activities feel increasingly necessary just to feel normal. What makes this particularly difficult to notice is that the change is slow and self-concealing. You don't remember the exact day when reading stopped feeling satisfying, or when cooking became a chore rather than a pleasure, or when you started needing background noise to do anything because silence had begun to feel unbearable. You just find yourself, years later, in a relationship with your own attention and motivation that you don't entirely recognize. The research supports this trajectory. A 2021 longitudinal study tracking adults across 5 years found that individuals with the highest social media consumption at year 1 showed the lowest hobby engagement and the highest self-reported boredom by year 5, even after controlling for pre-existing personality traits and depression rates. The relationship was dose-dependent. More digital consumption predicted more motivational flatness. How recovery works. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that the brain's plasticity that allowed the miscalibration to occur also enables the recalibration. The same mechanism that downregulates receptors in response to chronic overstimulation will upregulate them in response to a period of reduced stimulation. This is the entire premise of the dopamine reset. What recovery looks like, neurologically, is a gradual restoration of receptor sensitivity. As the extreme inputs are withdrawn, the brain slowly increases the density and sensitivity of dopamine receptors, raising the gain on the signal, essentially. Activities that previously fell below the threshold of perceived reward begin, over days and weeks, to register again. The first run after a week of reset may still feel effortful. By the third week, it is likely to feel genuinely pleasurable. Not because anything changed about running, but because your measurement instrument is now calibrated to detect it. This process takes time. That is not a marketing caveat, it is neuroscience. Receptor upregulation is not instant. The research suggests meaningful changes begin within 2 to 4 weeks of significantly reduced stimulation, with more substantial shifts occurring over 2 to 3 months. During the early period of the reset, there is often a phase that feels worse before it feels better, a temporary increase in restlessness, boredom, and difficulty concentrating. This is withdrawal in the literal neurochemical sense, and it is evidence that the system is beginning to adjust. Understanding this timeline is important because it reframes the early discomfort of a reset. The boredom you feel in the first week is not a sign that the reset isn't working. It is precisely the signal that it is. The discomfort of low stimulation is the system recalibrating. You are meant to feel it. Rebuilding through difficulty. There is a second dimension to motivational recovery beyond simply withdrawing stimulation. The brain doesn't just restore its ability to find reward in quiet activities through passive deprivation, it actively rebuilds motivational architecture through deliberate engagement with challenging tasks. This mechanism goes by several names in the research literature. Caroline Adams Miller, who spent decades studying goal achievement, described it in terms of hard goals, the finding that pursuing genuinely challenging objectives, as opposed to merely comfortable ones, produces stronger motivational responses and greater sense of agency over time. Neuroscientist Andrew Huberman and his colleagues have pointed to the role of dopamine spikes that accompany not just reward receipt but effortful progress, the phenomenon where the pursuit of a difficult goal, independent of achieving it, generates its own motivational fuel. The implication is practical and important. Recovery from motivational flatness is not just about removing bad inputs. It is also about reintroducing good ones, specifically chosen for their difficulty. The deliberate engagement with a task that requires genuine effort, something that makes you uncomfortable, that has a real possibility of failure, that demands you stay with it past the initiation dip, trains the dopamine system to take difficult tasks seriously again. It rebuilds the neural pathways that associate effort with reward. Small wins matter here, not as feel-good psychology but as neurochemistry. When you complete a difficult task and feel the satisfaction of completion, you are training your brain to update its prediction. Difficult tasks lead to genuine rewards. This prediction, encoded in dopamine signaling, is exactly what the effort discounting, overstimulated brain has lost. You are rewriting it, one completed difficult thing at a time. The key is deliberateness. You are not waiting to feel motivated before doing the hard thing. You are doing the hard thing as the mechanism by which motivation is restored. This reverses the intuitive sequence most people operate on: I'll do it when I feel like it, because for a miscalibrated dopamine system, feeling like it will not arrive on its own. You have to create the conditions for it. The long return: there is something both humbling and hopeful about understanding motivation through this lens. Humbling, because it strips away the narrative of willpower and self-determination that most productivity advice is built on. You are not unmotivated because you are weak, or undisciplined, or fundamentally less driven than people who seem to have it together. You are unmotivated because the system responsible for generating the wanting impulse has been systematically miscalibrated by years of environmental exposure to stimulation it was not designed to process in these quantities. Hopeful, because miscalibration is mechanical. It has a mechanism. And mechanisms can be addressed. The brain that recalibrated away from real rewards will, given the right inputs and the right time, recalibrate back toward them. The curiosity you feel toward a certain kind of book, the pull you used to feel toward a creative project, the pleasure you once found in physical effort, these are not gone. They are suppressed beneath a signal-to-noise problem. The reset is, at its core, a noise reduction process. When the noise comes down, the signal returns. Not all at once, and not without the effort of actively engaging with hard things while the system is still recalibrating. But reliably, and often with a vividness that surprises people because they had forgotten what genuine interest felt like, and then one day, in the middle of the reset, they find themselves absorbed in something without having decided to be absorbed in it. The book pulls them in. The run clears the head. The conversation lands. This is not a dramatic recovery story. It is a quiet restoration. And it begins, always, with understanding what broke and why, and then, rather than trying to force a feeling, creating the conditions in which the feeling can return on its own. Practical reflection: take 5 minutes to think back, not to last week, but to 5 or 10 years ago, or earlier if needed. Identify one thing you used to love that you no longer feel drawn to. It might be a hobby, a sport, a musical instrument, a craft, a type of cooking. It might be a kind of reading, fiction that used to absorb you, or nonfiction that used to leave you thinking for days. It might be something social, the kind of evening or friendship or conversation that used to feel electric and now feels like effort. Write it down. Be specific. Not exercise but Sunday morning runs. Not reading but reading long literary novels. Not socializing but those dinners with close friends that went until midnight. Now sit with this: the odds are very high that you did not outgrow this thing, and that your taste did not change, and that this is not who you really are. The odds are high that this is a calibration problem, that this activity's reward signal still exists in your nervous system, but that it is currently falling below the threshold of detection because the threshold has been raised by chronic overstimulation. Label this your motivation anchor. It is your reference point for the reset. Not a goal, not a target, just a compass bearing the direction toward which your motivational architecture is trying to return. As the reset progresses, pay attention to this thing specifically. Notice when the pull begins to return, even faintly. That faint pull is the signal. It means the instrument is recalibrating. The screen sleep sabotage. In 1965, Michel Siffry, a French speleologist, descended into a cave in the Alps with no watch, no calendar, and no natural light. He was conducting an experiment in chronobiology, the science of biological time, by living for 2 months in complete isolation from any external time cues. What he found surprised him. Without sunlight, his sleep cycle did not collapse into chaos. Instead, it settled into a remarkably consistent rhythm of roughly 25 hours, close to, but slightly longer than, the solar day. His body had its own clock, running steadily in the dark, independent of the world above. What Siffry experienced was the human circadian system operating in its default, unperturbed state. The body knows when to sleep. It has known for hundreds of thousands of years. The machinery is ancient, precise, and extraordinarily sensitive to light because for most of human history, light was the only signal the body needed. The sun rose, cortisol rose with it. The sun set, melatonin rose and temperature dropped. The nervous system decelerated. Sleep arrived. Now consider what we have introduced into this ancient system in the last 2 decades: screens. Light sources held inches from the eyes, emitting wavelengths precisely in the range that the circadian system is most sensitive to, operated for hours after sundown, delivering a stream of content specifically engineered to generate neurochemical arousal. The body tries to run its ancient clock. We point a spotlight at it and wonder why we cannot sleep. The melatonin story is familiar enough to have reached mainstream awareness. Blue light from screens suppresses the release of melatonin, the hormone that signals darkness and initiates the cascade of physiological changes that prepare the body for sleep. This is real, it is well documented, and it matters. But it is the smaller part of the story. The larger part has to do not with melatonin but with dopamine, and the sleep-dopamine relationship is a loop with consequences that extend far beyond feeling tired in the morning. A two-way street. The relationship between dopamine and sleep is bidirectional, and understanding both directions is essential to understanding why this problem is so self-reinforcing. In the first direction, what you do in the hours before bed affects the state of your dopamine system, which in turn affects your ability to fall asleep and the quality of sleep you get. In the second direction, the quality of sleep you get affects the sensitivity and function of your dopamine system the following day, which in turn affects how much stimulation you crave. These two pathways form a loop, and once the loop is running in the wrong direction, each night's poor sleep makes the next night more likely to be poor. Start with the first direction. The dopamine system, when activated, is an arousal system. It is the system associated with seeking, anticipating, and pursuing. It is fundamentally incompatible with the neural state required for sleep onset, which requires the deactivation of arousal circuits and the gradual quieting of the prefrontal cortex. When you engage with highly stimulating screen content in the hours before bed, social feeds, news, streaming drama, video games, you are not simply looking at a bright light. You are running your seeking circuitry at high capacity. Your dopamine system is active, engaged, and generating the anticipatory arousal that characterizes reward pursuit. Asking this system to abruptly transition into sleep is like asking a sprinter at full stride to come to an immediate, complete stop. It is biomechanically possible, technically speaking, but it is not how the system is designed to work. The dopamine system has momentum. Arousal has an arc. And when you ignore the arc by going from screen to pillow in under 15 minutes, you spend the next hour lying in the dark with a brain that is neurochemically configured for finding and pursuing, not for the passive surrender that sleep requires. Why midnight? Doom scrolling feels impossible to stop. There is a specific phenomenon that almost everyone with a smartphone recognizes but few people have an adequate explanation for: the midnight scroll that will not end. You know you should sleep. You are genuinely tired. You have, perhaps, explicitly told yourself multiple times to put the phone down. And yet you don't. The feed keeps moving. Another post. Another article. Another video that is already playing before you consciously decided to press play. This is not simply weakness or poor self-control, and it is not random. It is the predictable intersection of two powerful forces arriving at exactly the same moment: a maximally compelling variable reward mechanism and a maximally depleted prefrontal cortex. Variable reward schedules, the structure in which rewards arrive unpredictably and intermittently, produce stronger and more persistent behavioral responses than fixed reward schedules. This is one of the most replicated findings in behavioral psychology, established by B.F. Skinner in the 1950s and refined by decades of subsequent research. The mechanism works because dopamine is released not just by rewards, but by the possibility of rewards. The anticipatory signal is often stronger than the reward signal itself. When you scroll a feed and don't know what the next item will be, you are running the most powerful reward circuit your brain has, on repeat, with no endpoint. Now add the state of the prefrontal cortex at midnight after a full day of cognitive demands. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, impulse regulation, long-term thinking, and willpower, is a metabolically expensive structure that fatigues with use. Roy Baumeister's work on ego depletion, and the subsequent neuroscientific elaboration of that work, established that the capacity for self-regulation is a resource that diminishes across the day. By evening, after hours of decisions, social navigation, emotional management, and cognitive effort, the prefrontal cortex is running at diminished capacity. Your ability to override impulses, delay gratification, and make choices aligned with long-term values is at its daily low point. So at midnight, you have the most compelling behavioral loop in human technological history operating against the most depleted regulatory capacity you will have all day. The outcome should not be surprising. The wonder is not that people cannot put the phone down at midnight. The wonder is that anyone manages to. More than melatonin, the cortisol and comparison problem, the blue light and melatonin story, as mentioned, is real. But it captures only one pathway through which screens disrupt sleep, and arguably not the most powerful one. To understand the full mechanism, you need to add two more players, cortisol and social comparison. Cortisol is the body's primary arousal and stress hormone. It follows a daily curve. High in the morning, the cortisol awakening response helps you go from sleep to functional alertness within 30 minutes of waking, declining across the day, and lowest in the late evening and early night. This declining curve is part of what allows sleep to arrive. When cortisol drops, the nervous system downregulates. The body becomes less vigilant. Sleep becomes available. Now consider the content that typically appears in a social media feed or news stream at 11 o'clock at night. Political conflict. Health crises. Social injustice. A friend's life that appears more successful or exciting than yours. An argument you were not part of but feel drawn into. An article about a threat, environmental, economic, social, physical, that you cannot address or resolve. All of this content triggers a physiological stress response. Cortisol rises. The declining curve is interrupted or reversed. The nervous system, which was on its deactivation trajectory, receives a signal that there is something to be alert to, something to respond to, something that is not safe to sleep through. The social comparison dimension operates through a slightly different mechanism but produces similar arousal. Research by Ethan Cross and colleagues at the University of Michigan established that passive consumption of social media, scrolling through others' curated highlights, produces measurable increases in envy, social anxiety, and self-comparison, even when the viewer reports not actively thinking in comparative terms. These emotional states are associated with cortisol elevation and sympathetic nervous system activation. The brain does not distinguish between the stress of being chased by a predator and the stress of feeling inadequate by comparison to someone's vacation photos. The physiological response is the same system, running the same program. Add these two pathways, cortisol arousal from threatening or distressing content, and cortisol arousal from social comparison, to the blue light melatonin suppression and the dopamine arousal of variable reward, and you have a comprehensive physiological picture of what is happening when you use a screen in bed. You are not just keeping one eye open. You are biochemically reconfiguring your nervous system away from the state required for sleep, on multiple simultaneous channels. Sleep debt in the morning after what happens the following day matters enormously, and it is the second direction of the sleep dopamine loop that is most often overlooked. A landmark 2012 study by Nora Fokow and her colleagues at the Brookhaven National Laboratory used PET imaging to measure dopamine receptor availability in human subjects following sleep deprivation. The finding was stark. A single night of significantly disrupted sleep measurably reduced the availability of D2 receptors, the dopamine receptors associated with reward processing and motivation, in two key brain regions, the striatum and the thalamus. This was not a subtle effect. The reduction was comparable to the receptor downregulation seen in early-stage substance use disorders. What this means, in practical terms, is that the morning after a poor night's sleep, your reward system is literally less responsive than it was before you went to bed. You need more stimulation to feel the same level of reward. The threshold for what registers as worthwhile or interesting or satisfying has risen overnight. And so, the next morning, you reach for your phone earlier. You consume more. You seek more, with greater urgency, because the baseline has shifted. And then that evening, you are doing the same things, more screen time, more stimulation, more dopamine arousal before bed, and the cycle repeats, now with compounding effects. The sleep debt accumulates. Each night of reduced sleep quality produces a small but real reduction in dopamine receptor sensitivity, which produces a small but real increase in stimulation seeking, which produces a small but real increase in sleep disruption. Over weeks and months, this drift compounds into something that feels like a fundamental personality shift: chronic tiredness, increased anxiety, difficulty concentrating, heightened irritability, and the sense that nothing is quite as rewarding as it once was. This is not a personality shift. It is a loop. And loops can be interrupted. Sleep hygiene is not optional at this point. It is common for readers to reach a familiar category in their mental filing system: sleep hygiene. The term has accumulated a slightly scornful reputation in popular culture. It sounds like what a doctor says when they have nothing useful to offer, a collection of obvious tips that everyone already knows and nobody implements. Dim your lights. Avoid caffeine after noon. Keep a consistent wake time. The list is familiar to the point of tedium. The problem is not that sleep hygiene advice is wrong. It is that the framing underrepresents its importance. Hygiene suggests maintenance, optional self-care, things you do when you have the time and inclination. But for the purposes of a dopamine reset, for anyone attempting to interrupt the sleep dopamine loop and restore their reward system's baseline function, sleep is not hygiene. It is the foundation. Every other element of the reset, the reduced stimulation, the re-engagement with analog activities, the rebuilding of motivational architecture, operates on a substrate that is maintained or degraded by sleep quality. You can reduce social media use, you can practice deliberate difficult tasks, you can restructure your environment, and all of that work will be significantly undermined if your dopamine receptor availability is being chronically reduced by poor sleep every night. The neuroscience is unambiguous on this point. Matthew Walker, whose research on sleep at UC Berkeley produced his 2017 synthesis Why We Sleep, describes sleep as the brain's single most important maintenance period. During deep sleep, the glymphatic system clears metabolic waste products from between neurons, including the protein aggregates associated with neurodegeneration. During REM sleep, emotional memories are processed and consolidated in ways that reduce their cortisol triggering charge. And across the sleep cycle, dopamine pathways are restored, receptor sensitivity is recalibrated, and the neuromodulatory systems that govern mood, motivation, and executive function are replenished. You cannot outwork poor sleep with willpower, supplements, or productivity techniques. The maintenance has to happen. The only question is whether you are creating the conditions for it. The deactivation ramp, the most useful concept for understanding what good sleep preparation looks like, neurologically, is what researchers in sleep science call the deactivation ramp. Sleep does not arrive like a switch being flipped. It arrives as the endpoint of a gradual, progressive downregulation of arousal systems that takes, in a well-functioning nervous system operating under appropriate conditions, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes to complete. During this deactivation ramp, several things happen simultaneously. Core body temperature begins to drop, a process that is both a cause and a consequence of the shift toward sleep. Cortisol continues its evening decline. Melatonin rises, released by the pineal gland in response to diminishing light. The default mode network, the brain's resting state system, associated with mind wandering, memory consolidation, and the gentle loosening of executive control, becomes more active as the task-positive network quiets. Dopamine activity gradually decreases as the seeking and anticipatory systems are no longer being fed stimulating inputs. This ramp is not optional, it is how the biology works. What varies is whether you are supporting it or actively fighting it. Most people, most nights, are fighting it. The smartphone in bed represents a sustained, multi-channel assault on every element of the deactivation ramp simultaneously. It maintains cortisol through stimulating content, it suppresses melatonin through blue light, it keeps dopamine activity high through variable reward loops, it maintains task-positive network activation through engaging content, and it prevents body temperature from dropping by keeping the person awake, active, and reactive. Supporting the ramp means doing the opposite, creating an environment and activity set that allows each of these systems to do what they are trying to do naturally. This is not mysticism. It is engineering. You are creating the conditions under which a biological process that wants to happen can happen. What the evening protocol actually looks like, the science translates into a set of practices that, taken together, constitute what might be called an evening protocol for dopamine deactivation. None of these practices are individually dramatic. Their power is cumulative and consistent. Dimming the lights in your home in the final 90 minutes before bed is one of the highest leverage changes you can make. The circadian system reads ambient light levels as a proxy for time of day. Bright overhead lighting tells your hypothalamus that it is the middle of the afternoon. Dim, warm-tone lighting, lamps rather than overheads, candlelight, firelight, signals the approach of night and allows the melatonin release process to begin on schedule. This is not about avoiding blue light specifically, though that matters too. It is about the overall luminous environment. Dropping the temperature of your sleeping environment is another mechanistically important practice. Core body temperature must fall by approximately 1 degree Celsius for sleep to initiate and maintain properly. Sleeping in a cool room, somewhere between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, or 18 to 20 degrees Celsius, actively supports this process. Many people who report difficulty falling asleep are simply sleeping in rooms that are too warm for the physiological cascade to proceed. Analog activities in the pre-sleep period, reading a physical book, light stretching, journaling, gentle conversation, a bath or shower. Counterintuitively, the post-bath temperature drop accelerates the body's cooling process, engage the nervous system at a low level that is compatible with the deactivation ramp rather than interrupting it. The key characteristic of these activities is that they do not provide variable reward stimulation. A physical book does not have a notification system. It does not know how long you have been reading it and engineer a response to prevent you from stopping. It is engaging in a quiet, continuous way that allows the mind to gradually slow rather than remain in a state of perpetual anticipatory arousal. The hard rule, hard because the research supports nothing softer, is no screens in the 60 to 90 minutes before sleep. Not with brightness reduced. Not with night mode enabled. Not just checking one thing. The issue is not primarily the light, it is the dopaminergic engagement with the content and the variable reward structure of the platform. Night mode does not fix this. Dimmer brightness does not fix this. The only intervention that actually works is absence. This is, for most people, the most difficult part of the protocol. The phone is where the evening's entertainment lives. It is where the social connection lives. It is where the sense of being up to date on the world lives. Removing it from the pre-sleep period requires rebuilding an evening that was, often without noticing, entirely constructed around it. That rebuilding is not trivial. But it is also not complicated. It requires only time, alternatives, and the willingness to sit through the first few evenings of mild restlessness while the dopamine system adjusts to the absence of its usual evening inputs. The loop in reverse: what happens when you successfully interrupt the sleep dopamine loop, when you begin providing the conditions for the deactivation ramp, protecting the 60 to 90 minute pre-sleep window from screens, and getting the sleep that follows? The loop runs in the other direction. Better sleep produces higher dopamine receptor sensitivity the following day. Higher receptor sensitivity means that moderate stimulation, the kind produced by real activities, genuine human interaction, creative work, physical effort, registers as rewarding. This makes the day feel better, motivation stronger, and the pull toward excessive high stimulation seeking weaker. The reduced pull toward overstimulation means the evening is less frantic, the pre-sleep wind down more accessible, and the sleep that follows more restorative. This is the virtuous version of the same cycle. It does not require a personality transplant or the willpower of a monk. It requires only interrupting the loop at one point, consistently, for long enough for the biology to follow. The interruption point that is both most powerful and most practically accessible is the evening screen cutoff. It is the keystone practice because it sits at the junction of the two directions of the loop. It reduces the dopaminergic arousal that prevents sleep, and it enables the sleep that restores dopamine receptor function. Sleep is not a reward you give yourself for being productive. It is the maintenance window during which your brain restores the very systems that make productivity, motivation, connection, and satisfaction possible. Protect it with the same seriousness you would protect any system that, if degraded, degrades everything else that depends on it. Because that is exactly what it is. Practical reflection for the next 3 nights: before you go to sleep, record 2 numbers in a notebook or a simple notes app, not in a social or stimulation heavy app. The time of your last screen interaction, and the time you actually fell asleep or turned off the light. In the morning, note how you felt on waking: rested, tired, foggy, clear, in a single word or phrase. At the end of the 3 nights, calculate the average gap between your last screen and your lights out. Be honest. Include the quick check you did just to see the time and the 2 minutes of Instagram before you actually put the phone face down. Most people who do this exercise find the gap is under 15 minutes. Many find it is 0, the screen goes down and they attempt to sleep immediately, or fall asleep with the screen still on. The target is a 60 to 90 minute gap. That is not an arbitrary wellness recommendation. It is the time your nervous system needs to complete the deactivation ramp under normal physiological conditions. Any less and you are attempting to sleep before the biological prerequisites for sleep are in place. Do not try to change anything yet. Just measure. The measurement is often clarifying enough to change the behavior on its own, not because you force yourself, but because seeing the number makes the mechanism real in a way that abstract advice about sleep hygiene never does. You are not someone with bad sleep habits. You are someone whose deactivation ramp is being consistently interrupted at the worst possible moment. The data will show you exactly where the interruption is happening. The rest of the protocol is simply removing it. Level 1, the beginner reset, 7 days. You do not need to be broken to do this. You do not need to have hit rock bottom, deleted every app off your phone, or declared a personal crisis. Level 1 is for anyone who has looked at their screen time report and felt something they could not quite name, a mix of mild guilt and genuine surprise. It is for the person who picks up their phone to check the time and puts it down 20 minutes later having watched a stranger's vacation reel. It is for the person who cannot sit through a full meal without the low-grade itch to check for notifications. It is also for the person who has tried before. You downloaded the app limiter. You set the timer to 30 minutes. You hit ignore limit 47 times in a week and eventually deleted the app in mild shame. That does not mean you failed. It means you tried to change behavior without changing the conditions that drive the behavior. This protocol addresses the conditions. Level 1 is 7 days. That is short enough to feel manageable and long enough to actually feel something shift. The rules are not extreme. You are not going off the grid, quitting social media permanently, or throwing your phone into a lake. You are introducing small, specific constraints that will reveal, in real time, how much of your mental bandwidth has been quietly occupied. Here is what to expect honestly. Days 1 and 2 will feel fine, maybe even a little easy. You will think this is not that hard. Days 3 and 4 are typically where it gets uncomfortable: restlessness, irritability, the urge to check your phone for no reason other than reflex. This discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the signal that the protocol is working. You are feeling, for the first time in a while, the shape of a habit that has been running in the background without your permission. By days 5 and 6, most people notice a subtle shift. Quiet moments start to feel less threatening. You can sit with a thought for longer than 30 seconds. By day 7, you will have enough data from your own lived experience this week to make a real decision about what comes next. 7 days. Let us begin. The core rules: these 5 rules apply every day for all 7 days. They are not negotiable within a given day, but they are also not the whole protocol, they are the container. Everything else fits inside them. Rule 1: it means no social media before 10 a.m. Instagram, TikTok, Twitter/X, Reddit, YouTube Shorts, LinkedIn, none of it before 10 a.m. News feeds count. Phone in another room during meals, every meal. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Eat without your phone present. No screens 30 minutes before bed of phones, tablets, laptops, TV. The 30 minutes before you sleep is screen-free. 1 20-minute boredom window per day. Once per day, sit without entertainment. No phone, no music, no podcast, no book. Just exist. You can stare out a window. You can think. You can feel bored. Replace one scrolling session with an analog activity once per day. When you would normally scroll, do something physical or analog instead. Walk, cook, read a paper book, journal, stretch, clean. A few clarifications before you raise objections. What about music during meals? Keep it simple. No phone at the table. If you have a separate speaker playing ambient music, that is fine. The rule is about removing the device and the habit of checking. What if my job requires social media in the morning? If you genuinely must use it for work, use it, but open a browser, complete the task, close the browser. Do not browse your feed. The rule targets passive consumption, not functional use. Does a 20-minute boredom window have to be sitting still? No. You can sit, stand, lie on the floor, go outside. What matters is no input, no content being fed to you. You are not meditating, though you can. You are simply existing without distraction. The day-by-day structure days 1 to 2, the awareness phase. Your only real job in the first 2 days is to notice. You are not trying to transform anything yet. You are gathering data. What to focus on, follow all 5 core rules. When you feel the urge to pick up your phone, do not always resist it, but before you act on it, pause for 3 seconds and ask yourself, why am I reaching for this? What do I actually want right now? Then you can pick it up if you need to. The point is to introduce a moment of consciousness between the impulse and the action. Start keeping a brief log. You do not need a fancy journal, the back of a notebook, the Notes app, ironic, yes, but acceptable, a scrap of paper. Note the following when you notice a craving. What were you doing when you felt the urge? What emotion, if any, was present? Boredom, anxiety, loneliness, procrastination, nothing in particular? Did you act on it? By the end of day 2, you will likely have noticed 4 to 8 distinct trigger patterns. That information is valuable and forms the foundation for the rest of the week. Common experience at this stage: most people feel fine, maybe mildly curious. A few notice more anxiety than expected during the boredom window. That is worth paying attention to. Days 3 to 4, the resistance phase. This is the hard part. If you make it through days 3 and 4, you will make it through the week. What tends to happen around day 3, the novelty of the protocol wears off. The first 2 days had a slight adventure quality. You were doing something new, observing yourself with mild interest. By day 3, it just feels like deprivation. You may feel inexplicable irritability, restlessness, especially in the evenings, a strong pull toward your phone that has no specific reason attached to it, phantom phone checking, reaching for your phone and realizing you already put it in the other room. This is dopaminergic rebound. Your brain, accustomed to frequent low-grade reward hits, is registering their absence. This is not an emergency. This is your nervous system recalibrating. What to do during days 3 to 4. 1. Do not shorten the boredom window. If anything, lean into it. The discomfort you feel during those 20 minutes is precisely what you need to sit with. 2. Move your body. A 15-minute walk, some jumping jacks, anything physical. Exercise produces dopamine through a completely different and healthier pathway. It is the most effective tool available to you during resistance days. 3. Tell one person what you are doing. Accountability at the resistance point has a measurable effect on follow-through. Text a friend, I'm doing a 7-day reset this week, no social media before 10 a.m., phone-free meals. That is all. You do not need a support group. One person knowing creates enough external structure to matter. For, if you feel a strong urge to scroll, do the analog replacement activity immediately, do not negotiate with the urge. The longer you sit with it debating, the more energy it gathers. Common experience at this stage: genuine irritability, difficulty concentrating, and, for many people, the first real recognition of how automatic the phone behavior has been. Some people feel tired. That is normal. Your brain has been running on stimulation, the absence of it can feel like low energy. Days 5 to 6, the shift. Something typically changes around day 5. It is subtle, it is not a dramatic transformation, but it is real. You may notice, quiet moments that used to feel uncomfortable now feel merely quiet. You get to the end of the boredom window without checking the time as anxiously. The thought arrives that you actually follow to its conclusion. Rather than abandoning it to check your phone, you eat a meal and notice the food more. You feel mildly interested in something, a project, a book, a person, in a way that felt inaccessible earlier in the week. This is not a reward for good behavior. This is your baseline returning. The dopamine system, when it is not constantly taxed by artificial stimulation, starts to reassert its natural sensitivity. Things that were always mildly interesting start to feel actually interesting again. What to focus on during days 5 to 6, continue all 5 rules. Your focus now shifts from white-knuckling the restrictions to actively noticing what the reclaimed time and attention feels like. During your analog replacement activity, engage with it genuinely, not as punishment for not scrolling, but as the thing you are actually doing. Ask yourself, what would I do with my evenings if I genuinely did not want to scroll? You do not need to answer this question definitively. Just let it sit. If you have been keeping a trigger log, review it on day 5. What patterns do you see? What has surprised you? Common experience at this stage, a mix of feeling better and still having cravings. The cravings do not disappear on day 5, they just become less urgent. Some people feel more present in conversations. Many people sleep noticeably better by day 6. Day 7, reflection day. You made it to day 7. Follow all the rules for the full day. This is not a reward day where you get to binge everything you missed. But the focus of day 7 is looking back at the week and extracting what you actually learned. The day 7 self-assessment: find 20 to 30 minutes of quiet time after your boredom window works well and answer these questions in writing. Not in your head. Writing forces specificity. 1. What was the hardest rule to follow, and what does that tell you about where your most entrenched habits are? 2. What trigger surprised you most? What were you reaching for your phone to avoid feeling? 3. What moment this week felt most genuinely good, or most like yourself? 4. What will you do differently next week based on what you learned? 5. If you could keep only one rule from this week permanently, which one would it be and why? There are no right answers. The purpose is to move the week's experience from a vague felt sense into something specific enough to act on. Daily check-in tracker each evening. Take 2 to 3 minutes to complete this in a notebook. Keep it simple. You are not writing an essay. You are maintaining a data record of your week. Question: scale/format. Did I follow all 5 rules today? Yes/mostly/ struggled at craving intensity today. A 1, barely noticed, to 10, intense. How was my mood overall? 1, really rough, to 10, genuinely good. Did I complete the analog activity? Yes/no. What did I do instead? One thing I noticed today. 1 sentence, that is it. 5 questions, under 3 minutes. Do it before you go to sleep, after the screen-free window begins. You will be grateful on day 7 when you have a week's worth of data to review. Why paper? Because opening your notes app means opening your phone, which means one tap away from Instagram. Use a physical notebook for this if at all possible. A composition notebook is the right tool. What if you slip? You will probably slip at some point during the week. You will scroll before 10 a.m. You will bring your phone to dinner. You will watch YouTube at 11:30 p.m. This is normal, and it does not mean the protocol has failed. Here is the one rule about slipping: do not make it mean anything about who you are. A slip is a data point. It is not evidence that you are weak-willed or addicted or incapable of change. It is information about where a habit is most deeply grooved. Treat it the way a scientist treats a surprising result, with curiosity, not shame. The 3-step slip response: 1. Notice it without judgment. I just scrolled for 25 minutes before 10 a.m. State the fact. 2. Name the trigger. What was happening before you picked up the phone? What were you trying to avoid or feel? 3. Return to the protocol immediately. Not tomorrow. Not after lunch. Right now. The next action you take is protocol consistent. Do not add extra rules as punishment. Do not subtract rules as consolation. Just return to the protocol. The reset clock does not restart from 0 because you slipped once. This is a 7-day experiment, not a 7-day purity test. The only slip that actually undermines the week is the one followed by, well, I already broke it, so I might as well. That is the shame spiral, and it is the thing you are actually trying to avoid, not the original slip. Quick reference: Level 1 at a glance. Day phase, key focus. Day 1 awareness, notice cravings and triggers without judgment. Day 2 awareness, continue logging, identify 3 to 5 trigger patterns. Day 3 resistance, expect irritability, move your body, tell one person. Day 4 resistance, lean into the boredom window, do not negotiate with urges. Day 5 shift, notice what is starting to feel different. Day 6 shift, engage genuinely with analog activities, review your log. Day 7 reflection, complete the self-assessment, decide what comes next, what to expect during the week. The first 2 days will likely feel easier than you expected, which may produce a false sense that this is not that hard. Do not let that lull you. Days 3 and 4 are where the real work happens, and they tend to arrive with physical as well as emotional symptoms: low-grade restlessness, difficulty sitting still, a kind of ambient irritability that is hard to pin on anything specific. Some people report headaches. Some people feel an odd grief, which sounds dramatic but is accurate. You are removing something that has been a consistent source of comfort, however shallow, and the absence registers. By day 5, something softens. You will probably not feel dramatically different. This is not a movie montage, but there is a quieting. The silence that felt threatening starts to feel merely quiet. You may find yourself doing nothing in a way that feels okay rather than wrong. Sleep almost universally improves by the middle of the week for people following the 30-minute no-screen rule before bed. This is one of the fastest and most reliably reported benefits. If you notice nothing else, you will probably notice this. After the week, when day 7 ends, you will have a choice: return to exactly what you were doing before, carry forward 1 or 2 rules that felt meaningful, or advance to level 2. Most people who complete level 7 honestly find themselves somewhere in the middle. They do not want to go back entirely, but they are not sure how to formalize what they want to keep. That ambiguity is healthy. It means you are thinking about this deliberately rather than by default. The thing that most people report is not a dramatic life change. It is something smaller and more significant. They feel more like themselves. Not a better self, not a transformed self, just more present in their own life. That feeling is what level 1 is designed to give you a taste of. What you do with the taste is up to you. Level 2, the intermediate reset, 21 days, 3 weeks is not an arbitrary number. It is long enough that the changes you make will begin to feel like yours, not a borrowed discipline, not a temporary experiment, but the early architecture of a different way of living. Research on habit formation suggests that meaningful behavioral change requires somewhere between 18 and 66 days of consistent practice, depending on the complexity of the habit and the individual. 21 days puts you past the initial resistance phase and into territory where new patterns start to become automatic. Not fully formed, but no longer effortful in the same light-knuckled way. Level 2 is for people who have completed level 1 and are ready to go further, or for people who skip level 1 because they already know their relationship with their phone and screens is more than a mild issue. If you recognize the following: you reach for your phone first thing every morning before your feet hit the floor, you cannot watch a movie without simultaneously scrolling, you feel genuine anxiety when you do not have your phone within arm's reach, then level 2 is the appropriate starting point. You do not need to earn your way here. What is different about level 2 is not just the increased restrictions. It is the shift in orientation. Level 1 was primarily about removing things. Level 2 is about removing things and replacing them with something real. The goal is not to create a life with fewer screens. The goal is to create a life that is genuinely compelling enough that the pull of the screen weakens naturally. You cannot accomplish that in 7 days. You can begin to accomplish it in 21. The rules in level 2 are more demanding than level 1. Phone-free hours are longer and more structured. The daily walk is non-negotiable and earbuds-free. This last point will be the most unpopular instruction in the protocol, and it is also the most important. There is 1 full analog morning per week, a weekly digital Sabbath block, and a daily movement practice that has no content attached to it. These are not punitive restrictions. Each one is specifically designed to give your nervous system a different kind of input than it has been receiving. You are committing to 21 days. If you do level 2 honestly, not perfectly, but honestly, you will not come out the other side the same person who went in. That is both the promise and the fair warning. The core rules: these rules apply every day for all 21 days unless otherwise noted. Read them carefully before you begin. Understand each one. Do not start on day 1 with rules you have not thought through. Rule what it means: no social media until after 12 p.m. Instagram, TikTok, Twitter/X, Reddit, YouTube Shorts, LinkedIn, newsfeeds, nothing until noon. Phone-free hours, 7 to 9 a.m. and 8 to 10 p.m. daily. Your phone is in another room during these windows. Not silenced. Not face down. In another room. No entertainment before completing your most important task, and no Netflix, YouTube, podcasts, or streaming until the day's primary work is done. 1 full analog morning per week. 1 morning per week, no screens until noon. No exceptions. Choose a consistent day. Daily 30-minute walk, no earbuds, no phone, every day. Outside. No audio input. No phone. Walk and think and exist. Weekly digital Sabbath, 1 4-hour block, fully screen-free once per week, for consecutive hours with 0 screens. Choose a consistent window. A few clarifications on the phone-free hours. Yes, this means if someone calls during 7 to 9 a.m., you missed the call. You can call them back at 9 a.m. Unless you are on call for a medical emergency or a genuinely crisis-level professional role, your phone being unavailable for 2 hours in the morning is survivable. The reason the phone goes in another room rather than being silenced is that having it nearby, even face down, even silent, has been shown to reduce available cognitive capacity, because a part of your brain is always monitoring for the possibility of it. Out of sight is meaningfully different from in sight but off. On the entertainment rule, most important task means the one thing that, if it were the only thing you did today, you would call the day a success. You decide what that is each morning. It is not about doing all your work before you can relax, it is about not using entertainment as procrastination armor against the thing that matters most. On the walk, the no earbuds rule is the one most people resist most strongly, and it is the one that produces the most reported benefit. Most of us have not walked in silence, genuinely in silence, without audio input of any kind, in years. The 30-minute walk without a podcast or music is not wasted time. It is unstructured thinking time, which is something your brain desperately needs and almost never gets. The 3-week structure: Week 1, days 1 to 7 foundation. The goal of Week 1 is to build the architecture, not to feel amazing. You are establishing the routines. You are figuring out the logistics. Where does your phone go during the 7 to 9 a.m. window? What do you do with your hands during the phone-free hours when you would normally be checking something? How do you handle mornings without immediately reaching for a screen? Daily structure for Week 1, time block: what to do with 7 to 9 a.m. phone in another room. Morning routine: get dressed, make coffee or tea, eat breakfast, read, journal, sit quietly, move. No content consumption. Before noon, no social media. If you feel the urge, note it in your log and redirect. Before your most important task, and no entertainment. Do the task first. Sometime during the day, a 30-minute walk, no earbuds, no phone. 8 to 10 p.m. phone in another room. Evening routine: read, prepare for tomorrow, talk to someone in your household, decompress without a screen. The morning routine deserves specific attention. For many people, the 7 to 9 a.m. phone-free window will be the most disorienting part of Week 1, because mornings are when the checking habit is most automatic. The impulse to reach for your phone within the first few minutes of waking is not conscious, it is a trained reflex. When you remove the phone from the room entirely, that reflex has nowhere to go. What to do instead: have something ready. A physical book on your nightstand. A journal. A kettle set up to boil. The morning replacement does not have to be elaborate, it just has to exist, so you are not standing in the kitchen with an impulse and nothing to do with it. On withdrawal in Week 1, expect some version of what you felt in Level 1's days 3 to 4, but potentially more intense if your baseline screen use has been heavy. Irritability, restlessness, difficulty concentrating during the phone-free hours, these are normal and will peak within the first week. Do not interpret them as evidence that this is too hard. Interpret them as evidence that your baseline has been more stimulated than is healthy, which is exactly why you are doing this. The analog morning: once this week, choose one day in Week 1 for your no screens until noon morning. Saturday and Sunday tend to work best for most people, but use whatever day gives you the most flexibility. Mark it on your calendar before day 1 so it is decided in advance rather than negotiated with yourself on the day. The digital Sabbath. Once this week, choose a 4-hour window. Sunday afternoon is common, Saturday morning works well for some people, and commit to it before the week begins. Tell someone in your household. Put it on your calendar. The first one will feel longer than 4 hours. That is normal. Week 2, days 8 to 14. Deepening. The goal of week 2 is not to maintain. It is to build. All the rules remain exactly the same. What changes is the emphasis. Week 1 was about establishing the container. Week 2 is about what you put in it. By the beginning of week 2, the logistics of the protocol should be mostly sorted. You know where your phone goes. You have figured out your analog morning. The walk is becoming a non-negotiable rather than something you negotiate with yourself about each day. The friction of the new rules is still present, but it is starting to feel less novel and more just how things are. This is the moment to introduce a replacement habit. Not to fill the void is valuable, but to actively cultivate something that uses your reclaimed attention. The replacement habit should meet 3 criteria. 1. It is something you can only do in the real world, not on a screen. 2. It requires some sustained attention or skill. 3. It is something you have been wanting to do or return to. Examples of strong replacement habits for week 2: starting a physical book you have been meaning to read and committing to 30 minutes per day, a cooking project, learning to cook a cuisine you do not know, trying a new recipe each day, a physical practice, yoga, strength training, running, cycling, done without audio, a creative project, drawing, writing in a physical journal, playing or returning to a musical instrument. A maintenance or building project around your home or with your hands. The replacement habit does not need to be impressive. It needs to be real and consistent. 30 minutes a day of something you are actually doing, with your hands or your undistracted mind, is more valuable than any amount of passive consumption. The focus question for week 2: each morning during your phone-free hours, ask yourself, what am I building right now? Not in a grandiose sense, just as an orientation question. You are not only removing things. You are building something: a reading habit, a physical practice, a creative rhythm, a quieter mind. Make that explicit. Week 2 is also when social situations tend to create friction. You are now into the second week of changed behavior, and the people around you are starting to notice. We address this directly in the section below. Week 3, days 15 to 21. Integration. The goal of week 3 is sustainability. You are no longer in the acute phase of the reset. The rules are familiar. The habits are forming. The question shifts from, can I do this, to what version of this do I want to keep? Week 3 is where you begin actively designing your maintenance protocol. Not all 21 days of Level 2 rules will be sustainable forever, nor should they be. Some of them are reset rules, calibrated for intensity during a specific period. What you want to identify is the subset of these rules that feel worth maintaining indefinitely. The integration exercise for week 3, on day 15, sit down with your weekly check-in template and answer these questions in writing. 1. Which rules have felt most impactful? Which ones, when you follow them, make you feel most like a person living with intention? 2. Which rules have felt like genuine deprivation versus healthy constraint? 3. What replacement habit have you built, and how does it feel to have that in your life? 4. What is the minimum version of this protocol that would still be meaningfully different from your life before you started? The answers to these questions form the outline of your maintenance protocol, the set of personal rules you carry forward after day 21 ends. This is important. Without a maintenance protocol, day 22 tends to be a full rebound to exactly where you started. The point of week 3 is to prevent that. Final week daily focus. Each day in week 3, actively choose one rule to follow, not because you are obligated to but because you want to. The shift from I have to do this to I am choosing to do this is the marker of genuine integration. You may not feel it about every rule, that is fine. Even one rule that moves from obligation to choice is meaningful progress. Social situations. 21 days is long enough that your changed behavior will be visible to the people around you. Here is how to handle the most common friction points. Group chats. You will miss things. This is a feature, not a bug. If something in a group chat genuinely requires your response, it will still be there when You check after noon, or after 9 p.m., or whenever your phone-free window ends. If someone has an urgent need, they will call you, which is why your phone should always be reachable for calls even during social media restrictions. Group chats running on their own timeline without your continuous participation is not a failure of friendship. It is a recalibration of what is actually urgent. FOMO, fear of missing out, is most acute at the beginning of the protocol and decreases significantly by the end of week 2 for most people. The mechanism is this: FOMO is driven by imagining what others are experiencing. When you spend less time consuming others' curated highlights, you stop the constant mental comparison. You start to be more present in your own experience, which makes other people's experiences feel less urgent to track. You do not fix FOMO by forcing yourself to feel okay about missing things. You fix it by becoming genuinely engaged in your own life. That is what weeks 2 and 3 are designed to build. When people ask what you are doing, keep it simple. I'm taking a break from social media for a while covers most situations. You do not owe anyone a detailed explanation of your protocol. If someone pushes back or acts like this is extreme, that is information about them, not about you. If someone is curious and asks genuinely, share as much as you want. Sometimes that conversation is the most real one you have had with that person in months. Events and social gatherings, you are not avoiding real-world social connection, you are protecting your attention from the digital version. Go to the dinner party. Attend the event. Be present in the actual room with actual people. The protocol has nothing to say about that. Work exceptions: if your job legitimately requires social media or heavy screen use, you can make the protocol work without abandoning your responsibilities. The key is creating clear functional boundaries. Social media for work, use it on a desktop browser, not your phone. Set a specific start time, as close to noon as possible, and a specific end time. Close the browser tab when you are done. Do not keep it open in the background. Do not use work social media as a backdoor to personal browsing. Heavy screen work generally, the phone-free morning hours, 7 to 9 a.m., still apply. Your work screen and your phone are different things. Complete your most important task before entertainment consumption. This rule is compatible with computer-based work. The no earbuds walk in the evening phone-free window are non-negotiable regardless of your job. The hard truth about work exceptions: most people overestimate how much of their work social media use is genuinely necessary versus habitual checking with a professional justification attached. Be honest with yourself about which category you are in. If you truly cannot avoid social media until noon because of your job, adjust the start time, but be rigorous about making that adjustment as small as possible. Weekly check-in template: do this once per week, at the end of each week. Use a notebook. Allocate 20 to 30 minutes. Week number, check-in category, questions to answer. Rating, 1 to 10. Mood, how was my overall emotional baseline this week compared to last? Focus quality, how well was I able to concentrate on single tasks? Sleep quality, how was my sleep? Ease of falling asleep. Depth, morning grogginess. Motivation, how motivated did I feel toward my work, projects, and life generally? Relationships, how present and engaged was I in conversations and time with others? Weekly written questions, answer in your notebook. 1. What was the hardest moment of this week, and what drove it? 2. What was the best moment, and what made it possible? 3. Did I follow the replacement habit? What did I do? 4. What did I notice about my cravings this week? Were they more or less intense than the week before? 5. What is one thing I want to do differently next week? Save these check-ins. By the end of week 3, you will have 3 of them, and the arc across the 3 weeks: mood, focus, sleep, motivation, relationship quality will tell you something real about what this protocol has done for you. Quick reference: Level 2 at a glance. Week phase: core focus. Week 1, days 1 to 7. Foundation: build the daily architecture, establish phone-free hours, deal with withdrawal, set up the morning and evening routines. Week 2, days 8 to 14. Deepening: introduce the replacement habit, engage with reclaimed time actively, navigate social situations, shift from enduring to building. Week 3, days 15 to 21. Integration: identify what to keep permanently, draft your maintenance protocol, practice choosing the rules, not just following them. What to expect during week 1. The first week of level 2 will likely be harder than level 1 was. The restrictions are more stringent, the phone-free windows are longer, and the daily walk without earbuds will feel genuinely uncomfortable for many people, particularly the first few times. You are accustomed to having audio input during any transition between tasks. The silence of a 30-minute walk can feel, initially, like deprivation. It will start to feel like relief somewhere in week 2. Expect sleep to improve within the first week. The 8 to 10 p.m. phone-free window, combined with no social media scrolling in the hour before bed, tends to produce noticeably better sleep quality within 3 to 5 days. This is typically the first and most concrete benefit people report, and it tends to create early motivation to continue when other parts of week 1 feel difficult. Expect irritability. The 7 to 9 a.m. phone-free window, especially in the first week, can produce a kind of formless restlessness. You know you want to check something, you do not know exactly what, and the absence of the option creates mild but real agitation. This resolves. Usually by the end of week 1, it becomes much quieter. During week 2 tends to be when people have their first genuinely good day, a day when they feel present, capable, and more engaged than they have in a while. The replacement habit, if you have set it up well, starts to become something you look forward to rather than something you do out of obligation. The walk becomes a practice you actually want rather than a rule you are following. Social friction tends to peak in week 2. You have been doing this long enough that people notice and may comment. This can produce moments of doubt. Am I being extreme about this? And it is worth sitting with that question honestly. Being intentional about your attention is not extreme. Most people who push back are, on some level, reminded of something they do not want to look at in their own behavior. During week 3 often produces the clearest emotional experience. You feel what you are building. The replacement habit has 3 weeks of momentum. Your mornings have a different texture. The quiet moments that were threatening in week 1 now just exist as quiet. Many people report that they have more genuine energy, not caffeine-driven or stimulation-driven energy, but a steadier kind of engagement with their days. There is also frequently a moment in week 3 where the protocol feels constraining in a different way, not because it is hard to follow, but because you are ready to make it your own. That is the right signal. It means the reset has done its job. The rules served their purpose. Now you get to decide which ones become permanent principles and which ones you retire. After day 21, what most people feel at the end of level 2 is not euphoria. It is something quieter and more durable. They feel like they have their attention back. Not fully, not forever, but for the first time in a while, they have a working sense of what they actually want to pay attention to, and what they have been paying attention to by default. The maintenance protocol you design in week 3 matters more than any single day of the reset. The goal was never to live in a 21-day bubble. The goal was to experience enough clarity to make better choices going forward. You now have the data, 3 weeks of check-ins, a replacement habit with real momentum, and a lived understanding of how your nervous system responds to different levels of stimulation. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. Level 3, the deep reset, 30 days, there is a version of this chapter you might have hoped to skip. You tried the lighter protocols, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you opened this book already knowing that what you needed wasn't a 2-week experiment but something more thoroughgoing. Maybe the word burnout doesn't quite cover it. Maybe you've noticed that even things you used to love don't land the same way anymore. Maybe you sit down to do meaningful work and find that your mind simply won't cooperate. Maybe you've started to wonder, quietly and with some alarm, whether the problem is you. It isn't you. But it is your nervous system, and it needs more than a light recalibration. The level 3 deep reset is 30 days. It is the most demanding protocol in this book, and I won't pretend otherwise. It will ask you to give up some things you are genuinely attached to. There will be days that feel slow, days that feel bad, days where the voice in your head will make a very compelling case that you're being ridiculous and should just check your phone. The protocol will require you to do something that modern life has made nearly impossible: sit with yourself, without relief, long enough for your brain to remember what it actually is. This chapter is for people in one or more of the following situations. You've completed level 2 and want to go deeper. You are experiencing symptoms that might be described as clinical anhedonia, a flattening of pleasure and motivation significant enough that you've considered or should consider speaking with a doctor, and this protocol is something you're doing alongside, not instead of, that support. You are in genuine burnout, not the word people use when they're tired, but the state where effort and outcome have come completely uncoupled, where you can no longer feel the difference between a good day and a bad one. Or you simply want a profound reset, a line drawn in the sand between who you've been and who you intend to become. All of those are good reasons to be here. This protocol will change things. That is exactly the point. The core rules, all 30 days, these are not suggestions. They are the load-bearing structure of the protocol. You can adapt logistics around them, the exact timing, the precise format, but the rules themselves hold for the full 30 days. Ruled specifics: social media to 0, or strictly time-boxed, 1 15-minute session per day at a single designated time, no scrolling news, no consumption beyond 1 10-minute briefing per day if genuinely needed, entertainment streaming, nothing before 6 p.m., no exceptions for weekends, morning screen-free window, first 90 minutes after waking, no phone, no email, no computer, evening screen-free window, last 90 minutes before sleep, phone in another room. Daily movement, minimum 45 minutes of walking or physical activity, no earbuds, no podcasts, weekly analog day, a 1 full day per week with no screens from waking to sleeping. Alcohol audit, significant reduction or elimination. Alcohol directly suppresses dopamine regulation. Caffeine audit, moderate your intake, eliminate afternoon caffeine entirely. One hard thing per day, something that requires real effort and delayed reward. A note on the one hard thing. This is not busy work or punishment. It is the most generative rule in the protocol. The hard thing should require sustained effort and produce nothing immediate: learning an instrument passage, writing without editing, a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, a workout that takes you past comfort, reading something dense and unfamiliar. The hard thing is where you rebuild your capacity to want things that take time to arrive. The 4-week structure. Week 1, the withdrawal days 1 to 7. Let's be honest about what week 1 feels like. For most people, it is not pleasant. The withdrawal from high stimulation habits is real, and it manifests in ways that can feel alarming if you don't know to expect them. You will likely feel irritable. Small frustrations will seem disproportionately large. The mood swings are genuine. Dopamine downregulation means your brain's baseline reward signal is temporarily lower than it was before the protocol, because it hasn't yet adjusted upward to compensate for the reduction in artificial stimulation. You will feel restless. The urge to check, scroll, refresh, or reach for your phone will arrive in waves. At its peak, usually around day 3 or 4, it can feel almost physical. This is not weakness. This is your nervous system reporting a craving it has been trained to expect. You will experience vivid boredom. Boredom, if you haven't felt real boredom in a while, is disconcerting. It has a texture. It generates strange thoughts. It makes time feel remarkably slow. An afternoon can feel like it lasts for days. This is, counterintuitively, a good sign. Time slowing down means you are present in a way you haven't been. Time distortion is perhaps the strangest symptom of week 1. The absence of constant stimulation means you stop being swept downstream by a current of content. Each moment has to be inhabited rather than escaped. This is uncomfortable. It is also, in the long run, what you came here for. Week 1 daily structure, suggested, time activity: waking plus 90 minutes, no screens. Water, stretching, journaling, reading physical book, sitting outside. Morning block, your most important work or project, use the silence. Midday, eat without a screen. Walk without earbuds. Afternoon work, errands, creative projects, optional news briefing, 10 minutes, designated time, no rabbit holes. Evening, analog activities, cooking, reading, conversation, music, craft, last 90 minutes, no screens. Wind down. Sleep. Do not try to fill every moment. The discomfort of unfilled time is the protocol working. Week 2, the fog lifting days 8 to 14. Around day 8 or 9, something shifts. It doesn't happen all at once, it's more like a gradual increase in contrast. The world starts to look slightly sharper. A cup of coffee tastes noticeably better. You notice a quality of light in the late afternoon that you don't think you'd registered in years. This is not imagination. It is your dopamine system beginning to recalibrate upward. The receptors that were chronically overstimulated are becoming more sensitive again. natural rewards, food, movement, conversation, music, sunlight are starting to register at something closer to their true signal strength. Cognitive improvements typically begin in week 2. Focus, which in week 1 may have felt scattered and effortful, starts to organize itself more naturally. Many people notice they can read longer without losing the thread. Work that felt impossible in week 1 starts to feel merely difficult, which is its natural state. Some simple pleasures return this week, and they return with unusual intensity. Music is the most commonly reported. Songs you've heard hundreds of times land differently when your brain isn't drowning in stimulation. Eating without a screen, particularly food you've prepared yourself, often produces a pleasure that feels almost disproportionate. Pay attention to these moments. They are evidence. Your baseline is moving. Week 2 focus areas. Notice what gives you natural energy, make a running list, identify which hard things from week 1 you want to continue or deepen, begin building time for one project or skill you've wanted to pursue, reach out to one person for a real conversation this week. Week 3, the rebuild days 15 to 21. Week 3 is where people often describe a turning point. The withdrawal symptoms are largely gone. The clarity that began in week 2 has stabilized into something more reliable. And now there is a question that wasn't available before, because you were too depleted to ask it: what do I actually want to do with this? The reclaimed attention is real, and it is substantial. Studies consistently show that heavy smartphone users spend 3 to 5 hours per day on their devices. Even conservative assumptions say 2 hours reclaimed add up to 14 hours per week. Week 3 is where you have to make a decision about those hours. This is the transformative week, but only if you lean into it. Passive compliance with the protocol is enough to get you through weeks 1 and 2. Week 3 requires active intention. The week 3 project: choose one thing, a project, a skill, or a relationship. Not 3 things. 1. Category examples: skill, an instrument, a language, drawing, writing, woodworking, cooking, a cuisine you don't know, project, a piece of writing, building something physical, a business idea turned into a plan, a garden, relationship, one important relationship you've been neglecting, invest real, sustained, undistracted time, spend at least 1 hour per day on your chosen thing. This is not in addition to your other responsibilities, it replaces time that was previously spent on low-value consumption. At the end of week 3, you should be able to answer this question: what did I make or develop or deepen this week that wasn't there before? If you can answer it clearly, you are on track. Week 4, the new architecture, days 22 to 30. The final week of the deep reset is different from the others in character and purpose. The withdrawal is history. The clarity has arrived. The project is underway. Now comes a question that is more important than any of them: what do you want the rest of your life to look like? This is design work, not recovery work. You are not healing anymore. You are building. The week 4 architecture exercise: work through each of these in your journal, with honesty. 1. What will you keep permanently? Which habits from the protocol do you want to make structural, not because the protocol requires them, but because you felt their value in your body? Morning screen-free time? Evening wind down? Weekly analog day? Daily movement without earbuds? List them. Commit to them specifically. 2. What will you reintroduce, and on what terms? Some things you've removed for 30 days are fine to bring back on your terms, not the algorithms. Social media can coexist with a reset life if you use it the way you use a tool, deliberately, briefly, and put it down when you're done. Entertainment is not the enemy. Streaming a film you've chosen, with intention and presence, is entirely different from defaulting to it every night because you don't know what else to do. What returns? What are the rules? 3. What stays out? Some things you now recognize as genuinely harmful to your baseline, not morally, but neurologically. You know what they are. You felt the difference in week 1 when they were removed. Name them. Write down what you'll do when you're tempted. 4. What does the next chapter of your life look like? The project you started in week 3, where does it go? The attention you've reclaimed, what is it for? Emergency protocol: hard days. There will be days in the 30 where the protocol feels impossible. A crisis at work, a conflict at home, a night of bad sleep, a moment where the pull of your old habits is simply overwhelming. These days are not failures waiting to happen, they are tests of your floor. The emergency protocol is not abandoning the reset. It is the minimum viable version of it for days when the full structure isn't possible. Minimum viable reset, hard days 1. Keep the morning screen-free window, even if reduced to 30 minutes 2. Take a 20-minute walk outside, no earbuds 3. Do your one hard thing, even a small version of it 4. No social media until evening 5. Journal one sentence before sleep. What was one real thing I noticed today? That's it. 5 commitments. On hard days, this is enough. You maintain the foundation, you don't collapse it, and tomorrow you return to the full protocol. Social and professional navigation. 30 days is a long time, and you have a life. Here is how to manage the social and professional dimensions of the deep reset. At work, email and work-related digital communication are not the same as social media and entertainment. If your job requires you to be online and responsive, the deep reset accommodates that. The protocol is about discretionary stimulation, the hours that are genuinely yours. The morning screen-free window, the evening wind down, the analog day, all of these can coexist with professional responsibilities. What you are removing is the unconscious checking, the habitual scrolling, the digital consumption that happens not because it serves you but because it fills silence. That said, experiment with checking email only at 2 or 3 designated times per day rather than continuously. This is not a rule of the protocol, but it tends to dramatically improve the quality of the work hours in between. With family, you don't need to announce the deep reset to everyone in your life, but if you live with people, a brief, honest explanation helps. You're not joining a cult. You're running an experiment for 30 days that involves different habits with your phone and screens. That's it. Most people will be more supportive than you expect. The analog day in particular requires some negotiation if you have a family. Include them, if possible. The best analog days are ones shared. Cook together, go outside together, play a board game, have a meal that lasts longer than you planned. The analog day is not deprivation. It's a reminder of what was always available. Socially, you can still see people. The deep reset is not a social fast. In fact, in-person conversation, unmediated, undistracted, fully present, is among the most potent natural dopamine experiences available to humans. Protect time for it. What you're avoiding is the mediated social experience, the scroll through other people's curated highlights, the passive consumption of lives you're not actually inside. Real people, in real rooms, talking about real things, go toward that, not away from it. What to expect by the end of week 1: discomfort, irritability, slowed time, vivid boredom. These are symptoms of a system recalibrating. They pass. By the end of week 2, the fog begins to lift. Focus returns in fragments, then more consistently. Simple pleasures become noticeably more pleasurable. You start to feel, if not good, then at least present. By the end of week 3, clarity is stable enough to act on. You've started something. You have more evidence about what you actually like and want than you did 30 days ago. By the end of week 4, you've designed something, not just survived the protocol, but thought deliberately about the life that follows it. You know what stays, what returns on new terms, and what you now understand is a hazard. The thing most people don't expect: on day 30, you will not want to go back. Not because the habits you gave up were worthless, but because you've experienced the alternative, and the alternative is a version of yourself you'd forgotten was available. Sharper, more present, more capable of being moved by ordinary things. That person was always there. The protocol just cleared enough noise to hear them. Take that forward. The next chapter is about how. Making it last. The reset is over. Which means it has just begun. That sounds like a riddle, but it isn't. The 30 days, or 21, or 14, depending on which level brought you here, were not the destination. They were the clearing. They removed enough noise from the system that you could hear what was underneath. And now you are here, holding a version of your nervous system that is more sensitive, more alive to ordinary reward, more capable of sustained attention than it was when you started. The question is what you do with it. Here is what will happen if you do nothing deliberately: you will drift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, the way a boat with a slow leak doesn't sink immediately, it just gets heavier over time. The old habits are still available. The apps still work the same way. The engineering that made them compelling before hasn't changed. What has changed is you, and your new baseline, like any calibration, requires maintenance or it recedes. This chapter is about making the reset a life, not an event. That doesn't mean staying in the austere conditions of the protocol forever. It means designing intelligently for what comes next, which conditions to preserve, which habits to reintroduce and on what terms, and how to recognize early, before you're deep in it when the drift has begun. The goal is a life that doesn't require periodic emergency resets because you've built something sustainable instead. That is the real work. The protocol was practice for it. The maintenance framework, 3 tiers. Think of your habits in 3 categories. Not good and bad, that framing is too moralistic and too rigid. Think instead in terms of what each habit does to your baseline, and manage accordingly. Green zone, protect. These green zone habits are the ones the reset taught you to value. They are non-negotiable not because a protocol says so, but because you have now felt in your body what their absence costs and their presence provides. These are the habits you want to make structural, embedded in your environment and schedule so that maintaining them takes less willpower than abandoning them. Habit, why it matters. Morning screen-free window, 60 to 90 minutes, sets the cognitive tone for the entire day, protects the most neurologically valuable hours. Evening wind down, 60 to 90 minutes screen-free, protects sleep architecture, which governs dopamine receptor restoration. Weekly analog day prevents gradual re-escalation, functions like a weekly recalibration. Daily movement without earbuds, 30 to 45 minute minimum, the most accessible natural dopamine activity available. Non-negotiable for baseline health. One hard thing daily maintains your capacity to tolerate delayed reward, the core skill of a reset life. The question about green zone habits is not whether to keep them. It's how to protect them from the inevitable pressures that will accumulate over time. The answer is environment design, which we'll return to later in this chapter. Yellow zone, reintroduce carefully. Yellow zone habits are things you removed during the reset that are not inherently destructive but require clear boundaries to remain healthy. The key word is reintroduce, not resume at your old level with your old habits. You are introducing them into a new life with new terms you have set in advance. Habit, recommended reintroduction terms. Social media, designated times only, e.g., once at noon, once at 7 p.m., time limited, 15 minutes per session, never in first or last 90 minutes of day. Entertainment streaming, deliberately chosen, not default, maximum on weeknights, 1 to 2 hours, always preceded by something else first. A news consumption, 1 15-minute briefing at a set time, no browsing, no algorithmically surfaced feeds, podcasts and audio content during genuinely passive activities, commuting, light housework, not instead of silence during walks. Online browsing with intention and endpoint, use browser extensions to block or time limit high stimulation sites. The reintroduction principle is simple: you set the terms before you pick up the habit again, not after. Deciding I'll keep it to 20 minutes while you're in the middle of a scroll is like deciding how much you'll drink once you've started. It rarely works. Write the terms down. Put them somewhere visible. Review them monthly. Red zone, understand as hazards. Red zone habits are the ones that, during your reset, you discovered were genuinely harmful to your baseline, not morally, but functionally. They reliably push your dopamine calibration downward, making ordinary life less vivid, meaningful work less accessible, and natural pleasure less available. You are not required to eliminate red zone habits permanently. But you are required to understand them honestly, and to have a plan for when you slip into them, because you will slip. This is not pessimism. It is acknowledgement that these habits exist because they are powerful, and that power doesn't disappear because you've completed a protocol. Common red zone habits: unconscious, extended social media scrolling, no designated time, no limit, no purpose, continuous background media, television or streaming as ambient noise throughout the day, late night high stimulation content, reels, short form video, gaming past midnight, alcohol as a primary wind down mechanism, reactive, continuous email and message checking. Red zone habits need a response plan, not a moral condemnation. When you notice you've slipped into one, the response is simple: acknowledge it, don't punish yourself for it, and use the 333 maintenance check below to assess whether it's an isolated incident or the beginning of a drift. The relapse pattern, how drift happens. Understanding how people return to their old baselines is more useful than willpower alone. The drift is almost never dramatic. No one wakes up one day and decides to abandon everything they learned. It happens gradually, through a sequence that is surprisingly predictable. Stage 1, the exception. It begins with a single justified exception. You're stressed, or traveling, or something went wrong at work. You pick up your phone at 10 p.m. when you normally wouldn't. You scroll for 20 minutes. Nothing terrible happens. Stage 2, the new normal. The exception becomes occasional, then regular. The evening check becomes the norm again. The morning screen-free time shortens from 90 minutes to 60 to 30 to "I'll get to it after I just look at this one thing." Each step feels small. Stage 3, the fog returns. The cognitive symptoms return before you consciously recognize the drift. Focus becomes harder to sustain. Simple pleasures stop registering with the same intensity. You feel a low-level restlessness you can't quite name. You reach for your phone more, which makes it slightly worse, which makes you reach more. Stage 4, the rationalization. The mind is remarkably good at explaining why the current situation is fine and the reset was extreme. I'm managing it. I'm not as bad as I was. This is just what modern life looks like. These thoughts are not lies, exactly, but they arrive from the new old baseline, which cannot accurately assess itself. The early warning system, catch it at stage 1 or 2. The 333 check is designed for this. The 333 maintenance check. Run this once a month, ideally on the same day each month, the first Sunday, the last Friday, whatever you'll actually do. It takes 10 minutes. Answer each question honestly, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is consistently and easily. Focus, 3 questions. 1. This month, how easily have I been able to sustain attention on a single task for 45 minutes or more without reaching for my phone? 2. How often have I been able to read for 30+ minutes without losing concentration? 3. How easily have I been doing my one hard thing each day? Motivation, 3 questions. 4. This month, how often have I felt genuinely engaged with my work or primary activities? 5. How available has my sense of pleasure been? Have ordinary things, food, conversation, nature, music, registered with interest and satisfaction? 6. How motivated have I felt to pursue the projects and relationships that matter to me? Sleep, 3 questions. 7. How consistently have I been sleeping 7 or more hours? 8. How restful has my sleep felt? Do I wake feeling recovered? 9. How quickly have I been falling asleep, within 20 to 30 minutes of lying down? Scoring, 36 to 45, your baseline is strong. Continue as is. 27 to 35, early drift possible. Review your green and yellow zone habits. Return to stricter boundaries for 2 weeks. 18 to 26, significant drift. Run a level 1 or level 2 reset immediately. Below 18, full drift. Consider a level 3 reset and, if motivation and mood are severely impacted, consult a doctor. The 333 check is not a diagnostic tool, it's a signal. Its value is not precision but consistency. Running it monthly means you catch the drift at stage 2 rather than stage 4. Triggers and seasons. Certain life events reliably trigger regression. Not because you are weak, but because your dopamine system uses high stimulation habits as a coping mechanism, and stress or disruption activates that pattern whether you intend it to or not. High-risk periods to plan for. Trigger. Why it's high risk of preparation, work deadlines or crises. Stress activates habitual coping. Late nights erode morning and evening protocols. Pre-commit to keeping morning screen-free window even at cost of sleep time. Loneliness or social disconnection. Mediated social experience. Scrolling. Substitutes for real connection. Schedule in-person or genuine phone contact proactively. This is not optional. Major life transitions. Moving, job change, relationship change, loss all disrupt routine. Write out your green zone habits explicitly before the transition begins. Holiday periods. Social media ramps up. Family stress is real. Alcohol is more available. Designate the analog day as a family or personal ritual rather than optional. Winter months. Reduce light, reduced outdoor time, more time inside near screens. Compensate with light therapy, deliberate outdoor time, and earlier evening wind downs. The preparation in each case follows the same principle. decide what you'll do before the high-risk period arrives, not during it. A written commitment in your journal, in a note on your phone, anywhere you'll see it, is more durable than an intention you hold in your head while you're under pressure. Building a dopamine-healthy environment. Your environment is more powerful than your willpower. The reset taught you this. The reason the protocol worked is partly because it created conditions, structural, environmental, in which the old habits were harder to access and the new ones were easier. Maintaining the reset means making some of those conditions permanent. Physical environment. Where does your phone sleep? If the answer is next to my bed, that will undermine your morning and evening protocols indefinitely. Put it in another room. Buy a cheap alarm clock. This single change has an outsized effect. Where does your phone live during work? A drawer or bag, not your desk. Out of sight, out of mind is not a metaphor, it is a measurable effect on cognitive performance. What does your bedroom look like? No screens in the bedroom is an ideal. If that's not possible, screens often face down by a set time is the minimum. Digital environment. Which apps are on your home screen? Every app. There is a pull on your attention every time you unlock your phone. Delete or bury the ones that belong in yellow or red zone. Boring apps, calendar, weather, maps, on the home screen, social media buried or removed. Notifications, off for everything that is not an active communication from a real person. No news app notifications. No social media notifications. No X people liked your post ever. Browser, install an extension that blocks or limits your highest stimulation sites. Set the limits in advance, when you're not craving them. Social environment. This is the most important environment and the most difficult to control. The people in your life affect your baseline in ways that are difficult to overstate. Spending extended time with people who relate to screens and stimulation differently than you do now, who reach for their phones constantly, who treat high stimulation consumption as the default social activity, will gradually pull your baseline toward theirs. This does not mean abandoning relationships. It means having honest conversations about what you're trying to maintain, with people who matter to you, designing social time around activities rather than passive consumption, meeting for a walk, a meal, a game, a project, identifying the people in your life who actively support the version of you that came out of the reset, spend more time with them. The long game. The reset is not a one-time event. Think of it as an annual practice, a recalibration built into the architecture of your year, the way an athlete builds a deliberate off-season, or the way certain traditions build a seasonal fast. Not because you failed, but because maintenance is part of any meaningful practice. Before you finish this chapter, set a date. Not vaguely, a specific date. The first Monday of January. The week after your birthday. The first week of September when summer ends. Write it down. Put it in your calendar. Commit to running at least a level 1 or level 2 reset at that point, regardless of how you feel, because how you'll feel at that point cannot be assessed from here. A note on how you'll feel. The insidious thing about baseline drift is that the drifted baseline cannot accurately perceive its own degradation. At stage 3 of the drift, you don't feel as bad as you did before your first reset, because you're comparing yourself to the worst you've ever been, not to the best. The annual reset is a forcing function that bypasses this. You don't run it because you feel bad. You run it because you committed to it when your baseline was high and your judgment was clear. The person who committed to the date is the one you should trust. What to expect in the first month after the reset? The new habits feel effortful. That is normal. You are maintaining, not coasting. The effort will decrease as the habits become structural. Months 2 and 3, the habits begin to feel like defaults rather than disciplines. The morning screen-free time becomes the time you actively look forward to. The weekly analog day becomes something you protect rather than something you negotiate. Movement becomes non-negotiable rather than aspirational. At the 6-month mark, you will have caught at least one significant drift attempt, a period when things slipped and you either used the 333 check to catch it or noticed the symptoms and course corrected. This is the most important milestone. It means the system works not just when everything is easy, but when things get hard. At 1 year, you are ready for your annual reset. You approach it not as a punishment or a crisis response, but as a deliberate investment in the person you intend to be. You've done it before. You know what to expect. You know what it gives you. You go back willingly. That is a life, not a protocol. That is what all of this was for. What you're really resetting pictures someone sitting at a kitchen table in the early morning. The light is still gray. There is a cup of something warm in front of them, coffee, tea, it doesn't matter. They are not reading. They are not listening to anything. They are not holding their phone, not checking anything, not moving toward the next thing. They are just sitting there, in the particular silence of early morning, watching the light change on the wall. What is happening in that moment? Nothing, you might say. And you would be right in a narrow sense. But in another sense, something quite large is happening. A person is present in their own life. They are here, in this room, in this body, in this morning, not skimming the surface of 1,000 other lives and moments, not anticipating the next stimulation or dreading the last one. Just here. And here, it turns out, is interesting. The light on the wall has 3 distinct colors in it. The cup is exactly the right temperature. There is something they want to think about today, something that has been forming at the edge of their attention for days, and now, in the quiet, it is becoming clear. That state, which used to feel like boredom, which used to send you reaching for your phone the moment it arrived, has become something else entirely. It has become what rest actually feels like. What attention feels like before it is spent. What being alive feels like when you are not arranging your experience into content. That is what the reset was for. It was never really about the phone. The phone is a tool, a remarkable one that has given us access to things that would have seemed miraculous to any prior generation. The problem was never the tool. The problem was the relationship, a relationship in which a significant portion of your attention was flowing, continuously, toward something engineered to capture and hold it, and the rest of your life, the actual texture of it, was being experienced in a distracted, partial, skimming way that slowly degraded your capacity to be moved by any of it. Technology didn't steal your attention. No one stole it. You gave it freely, in small amounts, so many thousands of times that the small amounts became a flood, and the flood became the way you move through the world. The reset was an experiment in taking it back. Not permanently, not monastically, not as a statement about technology or modernity or how people should live. Just long enough to remember what it felt like to be the one deciding where your attention goes. Long enough to feel the difference between giving it and having it taken. If you've done any version of the work in this book, even 1 week of a lighter protocol, even 3 days of serious effort, you've felt that difference. You know it isn't abstract. It shows up in the quality of a meal eaten without a screen. In the particular pleasure of a walk where you were actually there, noticing things, instead of somewhere else in your headphones. In a conversation that had room in it for silence, for thought, for the other person to become more interesting than they were at the start. In the way a book can hold you for hours when your nervous system isn't firing at 10 times its natural rate. These are small things. They are also everything. The dopamine system is ancient. It predates smartphones by millions of years, predates civilization by a similar margin, predates language. It is the system that says, go toward that matters, that is worth effort. In its healthy form, it is the engine of everything humans have ever built, made, discovered, and loved. The drive toward food when hungry, toward warmth when cold, toward the face of someone you love, toward the answer to a question you've been holding for weeks, all of that is the dopamine system doing what it was designed to do. What happened to many of us, over the course of a decade or so, is that system got hijacked by inputs so perfectly calibrated to its triggers that it started firing constantly, indiscriminately, toward things that offered the sensation of seeking without any of the reward of arriving. An infinite feed doesn't resolve. A notification leads to another notification. A video ends and another begins. The system that was built to say go there, find that, make that started saying go here, no here, now here, and the things it was pulling you toward were not the things you actually wanted. A healthy dopamine system is not a quiet one. It is not the system of someone who has given up wanting things, retreated from stimulation, found peace through renunciation. It is a system that is pulled, strongly and with genuine interest, toward things that actually matter to you. Work that stretches you. People who are real to you. projects that take longer than your attention span to complete, which means they were worth starting. The physical world, with all its inconvenient beauty and texture and resistance. That is what recalibrates during the reset. Not the quantity of your wanting, but the direction of it. People who complete the deep reset report, fairly consistently, a particular kind of surprise. Not the surprise of difficulty, they expected that. The surprise is that the things they expected to miss, they miss less than they thought. And the things they didn't know they'd been missing, the quality of their own attention, the feeling of genuine absorption in something, the texture of time when it isn't being consumed, those turn out to be what they actually wanted. You notice more. That is the simplest way to put it. The food is more interesting. Not in some dramatic, psychedelic way, just noticeably, satisfyingly more there. The silence is less threatening. In fact, you start to find it valuable in a way that you can't quite explain to people who haven't tried it, the way you can't quite explain the difference between a good night's sleep and a bad one except by pointing to how everything downstream changes. Other people become more interesting when you are actually listening to them instead of constructing your response or monitoring your phone. This is the one that tends to catch people off guard. You thought the reset was about you, your focus, your productivity, your peace of mind. And then you have a conversation where you are entirely present, and you realize the other person is more complex and more generous and more funny and more troubled than you had registered before, because you hadn't really been there for enough of your conversations to accumulate an accurate picture of them. Your own thoughts are less hostile, less frantic, more like companions than background noise. This is perhaps the most private benefit and the hardest to describe. The internal monologue, which for many overstimulated people has become a kind of static, a constant self-commentary and low-grade anxiety and comparison and critique, quiets. Not completely and not permanently, but enough that something underneath it becomes audible. Ideas arrive more slowly and stay longer. The thoughts that have been forming at the edge of your attention for months about work, about relationships, about what you actually want have room to complete themselves. The world outside your window has been doing the same things it always did, the light changing, the seasons moving, the particular theater of whatever is happening on your street, and you were there for some of it, and for a while you were barely there at all, and now you are back. You are noticing again. Which means you are here again. There is a question worth carrying forward from this book, not the tactical question of how to manage your phone or structure your mornings, but the deeper one underneath all of that. It is a question you probably already know, because it arrived during one of the quiet moments the reset created. You may have pushed it away when it came, because it was a bit large and a bit uncomfortable and there wasn't anywhere obvious to put it. The question is, what am I actually for? Not in the cosmic sense, though if you want to take it there, be my guest. In the immediate, practical, this is my one life sense. Where do you want to direct your seeking? What would it mean to spend a year, not a week, not a month, a year, pointing your attention at the things you actually value? What would you make? What would you understand? What would you repair, or build, or become genuinely good at? What conversations would you have, and with whom, and at what depth? This question matters because the reset does not answer it for you. It can't. The protocols in this book can clear the static, lower the noise floor, restore the sensitivity of a system that had been running too hot for too long. But what you do with that sensitivity, what you aim at, what you build with the reclaimed hours, what you decide is worth the sustained effort of your attention, that is a question that belongs entirely to you. Some people come out of the reset knowing immediately. The project or the relationship or the skill that had been waiting was visible all along, they just hadn't been quiet enough to see it. Others find the question arriving more gradually, over weeks and months, as the clarity that the reset started continues to deepen. Both are fine. The question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It demands only that you keep asking it, rather than letting the noise flood back in and drown it. You have that attention now. Or you're on your way to having it. The question is what you do with it, not in the protocol sense, but in the largest sense of your life. There is a poet whose name I won't cite because the line will stick better without the attribution. She wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. I've thought about that for years, and I think it's true in both directions. Attention given to another person, real attention, the kind where you are actually there, actually listening, actually affected by what they say, is one of the most generous things you can offer. And attention given to your own life, the willingness to actually be here, in this room, in this body, at this moment, without the screen, without the escape hatch, is a form of generosity toward yourself that most of us ration with extraordinary stinginess. You spent some time learning to give it more freely. To yourself, to the people around you, to the work that matters to you, to the morning, to the silence, to the ordinary unremarkable texture of a life that is, in fact, entirely remarkable when you are actually inside it. Don't stop. Somewhere this morning, in a kitchen or a garden or on a commuter train or at a desk before the rest of the office arrives, someone is sitting with a cup of something warm, watching the light change, not reaching for anything. They are just there. And just there turns out to be the whole thing, the only place where any of it, any of the work and love and making and tasting and listening and noticing that constitutes a human life, is actually available. You know how to find that place now. Keep finding it.